I took the job because I needed the money. It wasn't anything special, just an overnight security shift at a remote camping site deep in the woods. The place was called Black Hollow Campground, an old site in upstate New York that hadn't seen much action in years. The owner, a guy named Rich, was trying to get it up and running again for the summer season. He had hired a few workers to clean up the trails and repair the cabins, but for now the place was empty. My job was to stay in the small ranger station at the front of the site and make sure no one trespassed. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a drunk hiker or some kids messing around, but that was it. The job seemed easy. I'd be alone, just me and the rain. I got there around 6 p.m. The place was already soaked. The trees swayed under the weight of the storm, and the sound of raindrops smacking against the roof of my truck made it hard to think. I pulled up to the small cabin that served as the ranger station. It wasn't much, just a one-room building with a desk, a chair, an old radio, and a cot in the corner. The walls smelled like damp wood, and the floor creaked with every step. There was a small window overlooking the entrance road, but other than that, I couldn't see much. The rain hadn't let up since I got there. I could barely make out the trees beyond the road, just dark shapes shifting in the downpour. I checked in with Rich over the radio to let him know I was on duty. He gave me a quick reminder: stay inside, check the perimeter every couple of hours, and call if anything weird happened. I sat down in the chair, listening to the rain. It was peaceful at first, almost calming. The sound of the storm drowned out everything else. But after a while, the silence underneath it started to feel heavy, like I wasn't really alone. I brushed the thought away, just my mind playing tricks on me. Couple of hours passed. I kept the lights low and watched the road, but no one came. The only movement was the rain pouring down in sheets, turning the dirt road into a muddy mess. At around 9 p.m., I decided to do my first walk around. I grabbed my flashlight and rain jacket, stepped out into the storm, and made my way down the main path. My boots sank into the mud with every step, and the wind made it hard to keep the beam of my flashlight steady. The campground had about a dozen small cabins spread out along a winding trail, along with a few picnic areas and fire pits. I checked the nearest cabins first. The doors were all locked, and nothing seemed out of place. The rain made it hard to hear anything, but I didn't see any signs of movement. I moved deeper into the site, past the picnic area, toward the last few cabins near the woods. These were the oldest ones, barely more than wooden shells with rotting floors. The third cabin on the left had its door slightly open. I stopped. I knew for a fact that Rich had told me all the cabins were locked before I got there. I stepped closer, shining my light inside. The cabin was empty, nothing but a few broken chairs and an old metal bed frame. But the door had definitely been opened recently. I didn't like that. I stepped inside to get a better look, my boots making wet prints on the floor. There weren't any footprints leading inside, but the rain would have washed them away anyway. I shined my light across the walls, looking for anything out of place. Nothing, just water dripping from the ceiling. I backed out and shut the door tight. I told myself it was probably the wind, even though I knew it wasn't. The walk back felt longer than before. The trees loomed taller, the rain hit harder, and the wind felt colder. When I got back to the ranger station, I locked the door behind me. I didn't know why, but it made me feel better. I sat back down and tried to shake the feeling that someone was out there. The hours dragged on. The rain never stopped. At around midnight, I was starting to doze off when I heard something outside. A soft crunch, like footsteps in the mud. I sat up, heart pounding. I turned off the small desk lamp and moved toward the window. The rain made it hard to see anything, but for a second, I thought I saw movement near the trees. A dark shape standing still, just past the road. I grabbed my flashlight, but by the time I turned it on and pointed it outside, the shape was gone. I told myself I was imagining things, just the rain playing tricks on my eyes. But I knew that wasn't true. I checked the radio to see if I could call Rich, but the storm had killed the signal. I was on my own. I forced myself to wait. I wasn't about to go chasing shadows into the woods. If someone was out there, they'd have to come to me. At around 2 a.m., I heard the noise again. This time it was closer. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I turned off my flashlight and sat completely still. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I gripped the handle of my knife, barely breathing. Then silence. The rain poured, the wind howled, but whoever was out there was gone. I didn't move, not for a long time. The rest of the night dragged on, slow and painful. Every noise made my skin crawl. I kept my eyes on the window, waiting for another glimpse of whatever I had seen before. By the time the sun started to rise, I had barely moved. At 6 a.m., I stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the ground a mess of mud and broken branches. I walked around the cabin, scanning for footprints. There were several, deep prints in the mud. Someone had definitely been out there watching me. I followed them toward the tree line, but they disappeared into the underbrush. I didn't know who it was. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. They had been standing at my door, listening, and if I had opened it, I don't think I would have made it through the night. I never liked camping much, but my ex-husband, Greg, always did. Even after the divorce, we somehow found ourselves planning one last trip together. It wasn't about rekindling anything, we had long since burned out, but we had a habit of doing things out of nostalgia, and this was one of them. It was late September, just as the summer air turned crisp. The days were still warm, but the nights had a chill that settled into your bones. Greg had picked a remote spot in the Adirondacks, far from any official campsite. A place he had been to once in his 20s. Barely anyone goes there, he had said when we planned it. Took us almost 6 hours to drive there. The roads turned from highways to small 2-lane roads, then to dirt paths where the trees closed in on either side. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, thick with that rich scent that makes you feel far from civilization. I had a nervous feeling in my stomach, but I chalked it up to the idea of being alone in the woods with my ex. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The shadows stretched long, the light filtering through the leaves in a way that made the forest seem endless. There was no cell service, no nearby campers, nothing but the sounds of the wind and birds. We set up our tent near a small clearing, not far from a narrow creek. Greg built a fire and I unpacked our gear. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling uneasy for no real reason. Greg noticed. "You good?" he asked. I nodded, brushing off the feeling. Night fell fast. The fire crackled, sending up little sparks that disappeared into the darkness. We ate in silence, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. The air was cool, and the forest around us felt unnervingly quiet. That's when we saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight. A figure standing just beyond the trees, barely visible in the dark. My heart pounded, and I instinctively grabbed Greg's arm. The old man stepped forward. His clothes were ragged, worn from the elements. His beard was thick, gray, and unkempt. His eyes, dark and sunken, locked onto us like he had been watching for a long time. He didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there staring. Greg slowly reached for the hatchet lying near the firewood pile. I felt frozen in place, my pulse hammering. After what felt like an eternity, the man turned and walked back into the woods. His movement was slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world. We didn't sleep that night, Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. Greg kept the hatchet close, and I kept the flashlight in my grip until my fingers ached. Morning came slow. The fire had died down to embers, the forest thick with an eerie silence. There were no birds, no wind, just the oppressive stillness of the trees. Greg checked around the campsite. Footprints, he muttered. I saw them too. Deep impressions in the dirt, leading from the trees to where he had stood. But there were more, dozens of them circling our tent. Someone, or something, had been walking around us all night. We packed up fast. Neither of us said much. We just wanted to get out of there. The whole time, I felt like we were being watched. And as we drove away, kicking up dirt on the narrow road, I swore I saw a figure standing between the trees, watching, waiting. It was the kind of night you wouldn't wish on anyone. The wind was picking up, rattling through the branches of the pine trees, making them groan and sway. The forest around me felt endless, like I was swallowed whole by the wilderness. My name's Tom, and I'd come to New Mexico to clear my head for a weekend, something I thought would help after a tough couple of months. Work had been overwhelming, and I hadn't had a chance to really get away in years. My cousin, Mark, had invited me to join him for a camping trip in the Carson National Forest, promising it would be a peaceful getaway. I wasn't exactly sure what I expected, but the towering trees, the smell of damp earth, and the isolation were starting to feel more like a weight than a relief. I was alone now, though. Mark had gone ahead with some of his other buddies to check out a spot they thought would be good for fishing. I didn't feel like tagging along, so I opted to set up camp near the edge of a small creek, where the water babbled over rocks and the landscape was more serene. The spot seemed isolated enough that I wouldn't be disturbed, yet close enough that I wouldn't feel completely cut off from the world. I was about 30 minutes from the nearest town, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles. The day had been uneventful. I'd spent hours walking along the creek, looking at the jagged mountains in the distance, and taking in the scenery. The forest had a strange feeling to it, though. I couldn't place it, but it was almost as if the trees were watching me. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe the silence of the place was unnerving. Whatever it was enough to make me feel on edge, and I found myself looking over my shoulder more than once. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped rapidly. I dug out my jacket from my backpack and got a small fire going. The flames crackled, and I huddled closer, feeling the heat seep into my bones. The sky overhead was a darkening shade of blue, and the stars began to blink into existence one by one. The forest around me was alive with sounds: chirping insects, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, but it still felt empty, like the trees were just waiting for something. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and began to unwind, pulling out a can of beans and heating it over the fire. My plan had been simple: eat, relax, and get some sleep. But then the wind started picking up again, carrying with it an odd smell. It was a mixture of earth and something else, something rancid like spoiled meat. My stomach turned, and I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I told myself it was probably just the forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The night deepened, and I finished eating. As I sat by the fire, I kept my eyes on the darkened edge of the forest, where shadows twisted and stretched with the movement of the trees. The firelight barely reached that far, but every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but then the movement grew more deliberate, like someone or something was walking along the tree line just out of view. I stood up, heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to call out, but then I remembered that Mark and his friends were miles away, and there was no one else nearby. The thought of it being some kind of animal didn't sit right with me either. The sound was too purposeful, too human. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and clicked it on, casting its beam toward the edge of the forest. Nothing, only darkness and the faint rustling of the wind. I kept the light there for a long time, trying to make sense of the noise. There was no way an animal could be that close, right? It didn't make sense. I figured it was probably just a tree branch snapping in the wind, or my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was out there, something watching me. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, howling through the branches, and I quickly moved to stoke the fire, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my back. The firelight flickered and danced, casting strange, elongated shadows around my camp. I watched the flames for a moment, entranced by their movement, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the camp, barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure. It was a tall man, dressed in tattered clothes, and his face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, unmoving. For a second, I thought my mind was playing tricks, but no, there was no mistaking the silhouette. He was real, and he was watching me. I froze, my heart in my throat, and didn't know what to do. There was no road to safety, no quick escape. If I ran, he'd hear me for sure. The wind howled, and I felt a panic rise in my chest. The man's presence was oppressive, suffocating, like a storm had descended on me. I reached for my phone, but it was useless. I had no service out here, and even if I did, I wasn't sure what I'd say. "Hey, there's some guy standing by my camp?" My mind raced through options, but none seemed feasible. I grabbed a large stick from the ground, something heavy enough to use as a weapon, and held it tightly in my hands. The man still didn't move, just stood there in the darkness like he was waiting for something. The silence between us felt deafening, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The wind shifted again, bringing with it that terrible smell, stronger now, almost unbearable. The man took a step forward, just one slow, deliberate step, and I heard the faintest creak of his boots against the dirt. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I had to do something. I wasn't about to wait to find out what he was up to. I raised my flashlight high, aiming it directly at the man, and flicked it on, casting a blinding beam right at him. The man recoiled, raising his arm to shield his eyes. For a moment, he was just a silhouette in the light, and then he turned and disappeared into the trees, blending with the darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, holding the stick, trying to process what had just happened. My thoughts were jumbled, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell lingered, but it was faint now, almost gone. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or more terrified. My mind was racing with 1,000 questions. Who was that man, and why was he out here, in the middle of nowhere? But I didn't have time to answer them. I needed to figure out what to do next. The wind had died down again, and the fire was flickering low. I couldn't sleep with the man out there, no matter how far away he might be now. I decided to pack up. I wouldn't stay out here alone tonight. I didn't know if it was the right thing to do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I quickly gathered my things, packing my bag as quickly as I could without making too much noise. The darkness felt heavier now, like it was pressing in from all sides. I had no clear plan, no idea where I would go, but I needed to get out of this place. I wasn't sure what I was running from, but I didn't want to find out. The sound of crunching leaves behind me made my heart skip a beat. I turned sharply, and there he was again, the man. He was walking slowly toward me, as if he'd never left, his eyes hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. My breath caught in my throat. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and swung it in his direction, my heart racing as the beam illuminated his figure. But this time, he didn't retreat. He didn't even blink. He was too close. I backed away, my hands still gripping the flashlight, unsure what to do next. I didn't wait for him to take another step. I turned and ran. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, rocks and branches threatening to trip me as I sprinted through the trees. My mind was a whirlwind of panic. I couldn't see where I was going, only the flashing beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness ahead of me. The man didn't chase me. He didn't have to. I was running blindly, desperate to put distance between us, and in the end, I tripped, falling hard onto the ground. I got up, my palms scraped and bleeding, but I didn't stop. I kept running, my body shaking with fear, my lungs burning from the exertion. But in the end, it didn't matter. I made it to a road, an old dirt track that wound its way through the forest. I didn't know if I'd gone off the trail, but I didn't care. I just kept running, not stopping until I reached a small cabin, the lights on inside. That's where I found help, and I made it out of the forest. The man was never found. Some people said I was imagining things, but I know what I saw. I'm not sure what his intentions were, but I don't plan to ever find out. I made it out that night, but there's a part of me that'll never forget what happened. Maybe it was just a coincidence, maybe it wasn't, but I'll never go back to that forest again. Not for anything. And if you ever find yourself camping alone in New Mexico, keep your eyes open. You never know who or what you might find lurking in the dark. I had been planning the trip for months. Just a simple, quiet camping trip deep in the woods. I needed to get away from the city, from the constant noise, the stress, the people. I had always loved being alone in the wilderness, where it was just me, the trees, and the sound of nature. No emails, no traffic, no obligations. Just quiet. I picked a remote spot in the Adirondacks, far from any established campsites. I didn't want to be near anyone. I had found a small clearing near a slow-moving stream, about 5 miles from the closest trail. It was perfect, peaceful, the kind of place where you could sit by a fire and forget about everything. I parked my truck at the base of a dirt road and hiked in with my gear. The hike took nearly 3 hours, but it was worth it. The air was crisp, the smell of pine heavy in the air. I could hear the distant call of a woodpecker, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. By late afternoon, I had my tent set up and a small fire going. I cooked a simple meal over the flames and sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. As the sun set, the sky turned a deep shade of purple, and the temperature dropped. I wrapped myself in a thick flannel and watched as the fire crackled and sent sparks into the night air. It was exactly what I needed. I woke up in the middle of the night, unsure of what had stirred me. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest was quiet. Too quiet. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves. Just silence. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate step somewhere in the darkness. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too heavy, too purposeful. Another step. Closer. Then another. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping it through the trees. Nothing. Just the thick black of the woods. My heart pounded as I listened, but the sound had stopped. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a deer moving through the undergrowth. I told myself that over and over until I finally fell back asleep. The next morning, I woke early, the unease from the night still lingering in my gut. I stepped outside my tent and scanned the area. Everything seemed normal, but then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the trees to the edge of my campsite. Not animal prints. Bootprints. Someone had been here, watching me. A chill ran down my spine. I crouched down, examining them closely. The prints were deep, made by someone heavy, and they circled my campsite before disappearing back into the woods. I looked around, scanning the tree line. There was no one, no sound, just the endless, towering trees. I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a hiker who had gotten curious. Maybe they had passed through and left. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I should have packed up right then and there, hiked back to my truck and left. But I didn't. I convinced myself I was overreacting. I had spent years camping alone, and I wasn't going to let some stray footprints ruin that. So I stayed. The day passed quietly. I fished in the stream, cooked another meal, and forced myself to relax. By nightfall, I was sitting by the fire again, telling myself that everything was fine. But then, just as the last light of day faded, I heard something again. A rustling in the bushes. Slow, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, landing on the thick brush. The leaves trembled. Something or someone was there. I stood slowly, my pulse hammering. "Hello," I called out, my voice hoarse. Nothing. Then, in an instant, the sound stopped. The bushes stilled. The woods went silent again. I shined the light in every direction, my skin crawling. And then I saw it. Further back, just beyond the reach of my flashlight, a figure stood in the trees. A man, motionless, watching me. I couldn't see his face, just the outline of his body, tall and unmoving. My breath came in short gasps as I slowly backed toward my tent. I had my hunting knife with me, but what good was that against someone lurking in the dark? I kept my light on him, my fingers gripping the handle of my knife. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and vanished into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside my tent, gripping my knife, listening for any sign of movement. But the woods stayed silent. At first light, I packed up my gear in record time. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my sleeping bag into my pack. Every second I spent in that clearing felt like a mistake. I started the hike back, moving fast, my ears straining for any sound behind me. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. Someone was following me. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see him. I picked up my pace, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a full sprint. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The footsteps behind me stayed steady, keeping pace. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A pile of stones, stacked in a small tower, right in the middle of the trail. It hadn't been there before. Someone had placed it there. A sign, a warning. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes, my pack bouncing against my back. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran until my legs burned, until I burst out of the tree line and saw my truck. I threw my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the dirt road, my tires kicking up dust and gravel. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Only then did I glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. I never went back. I don't go camping much. I never really did, even when I was a kid. Something about being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and the unknown, always made me uneasy. But my cousin Eric was the opposite. He was the type who grew up playing in the woods, hunting, fishing, and doing all the things that made him feel at home in the wilderness. Maybe that's why he ended up becoming a cop. He had that kind of personality, always looking for something to chase, something to figure out. It was late September of 2017 when he convinced me to go camping with him. I hadn't seen him in a while, and after all the times I had turned down his invites, I figured I owed him one. He promised it would just be a weekend trip, 2 nights, nothing crazy. He had a spot deep in the woods, about an hour outside of our hometown in Minnesota, a place he'd camped at plenty of times before. "It's quiet," he said. "Good to get away from everything." At the time, I figured that meant getting away from the stress of work, family, and everyday life. I didn't realize just how isolated he really meant. We packed up early on a Friday afternoon. Eric had all the gear. His truck bed was loaded with a big tent, sleeping bags, a cooler, a small propane stove, and all the other essentials. He even brought his rifle, just in case we ran into a bear or some other wildlife. I didn't think we'd need it, but I didn't argue. It made him feel safer, and honestly, knowing he was armed did give me a little extra peace of mind. The drive took us out past the last of the paved roads, onto gravel, and eventually onto what barely counted as a trail. Trees closed in around us on either side, the thick green of late summer just starting to fade into the yellows and browns of early fall. The sun sat low in the sky by the time we arrived, casting long shadows through the trees. The campsite was just a small clearing. No marked spots, no designated fire pits, just nature. A little creek ran nearby, and beyond that, the forest stretched for miles. No cell service, no signs of other people, just us. I wasn't exactly thrilled about how remote we were, but Eric was right. It was peaceful. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth, and for a while, I felt myself relaxing as we set up camp. We pitched the tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going just as the last light faded from the sky. The first night was uneventful. We cooked up some food, had a couple of beers, and talked about life, work, family, all the usual stuff. Eric told a few stories from his job, nothing too crazy, just the kind of things cops deal with that never make the news. Eventually, we turned in for the night. The tent was surprisingly comfortable, and despite my usual unease about being in the woods, I fell asleep pretty fast. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, though. Something felt off. At first, I thought maybe it was just the sounds of the forest, branches shifting, leaves rustling in the breeze. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't just the usual background noise of nature. There was something else, something moving. I didn't want to overreact, so I stayed quiet, listening carefully. The sound wasn't close, but it was steady footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. I shifted slightly, trying to see if Eric was awake, but he was out cold. His steady breathing filled the tent. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me, and eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I told Eric about what I'd heard. He didn't seem too concerned. "Probably a deer," he said, brushing it off. "Maybe a coyote." I wanted to believe that, so I didn't press the issue. The second day was good. We hiked a bit, fished in the creek, and just enjoyed being out in nature. Eric seemed completely at ease, and I started to feel a little silly for getting so spooked the night before. By the time we sat down for dinner that evening, I had almost forgotten about it entirely. But that night, the feeling came back. This time, it wasn't just footsteps in the distance. It was closer. I woke up again, just like the night before, but this time, there was no mistaking it. Something or someone was moving just outside our tent. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. My heart pounded in my chest. I listened, soft crunching in the dirt, a faint shuffle of fabric, like someone brushing against the side of the tent. Then silence, the kind of silence that feels intentional. I lay there for what felt like forever, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. Eventually, the sounds faded away, and again, I must have fallen back asleep. By morning, I had convinced myself I had imagined it. But when we stepped outside, I saw Eric's expression change the moment he looked around the campsite. Something had been there. The firewood we had stacked was knocked over. A few of our supplies had been moved, not taken, just shifted. Eric didn't say anything at first, but I could see the shift in his demeanor. He was a cop, he noticed things. "You sure you didn't hear anything last night?" I asked. He shook his head. "I was out, but..." He trailed off, scanning the ground. Something was here. I felt the knot tighten in my stomach. "Animal?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Eric didn't reply right away. He crouched down near the fire pit, studying the dirt. "No tracks," he finally said. "At least nothing clear." He stood up, brushing off his hands. "Let's pack up." I didn't argue. We tore down camp fast, faster than I had ever packed anything in my life. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. Eric was tense, and if he was tense, I knew we had a reason to leave. The drive back felt longer than it should have. The trees pressed in around us, and every shadow between them felt like something watching. Neither of us spoke much. It wasn't until we were back on paved roads, with the town in sight, that Eric finally exhaled. "I don't know what was out there," he said, gripping the wheel a little too tight, "but we weren't alone." I nodded. Neither of us ever talked about that trip again. But I know one thing, Eric never invited me camping after that. And I never asked, because whatever was out there that night, it wasn't just some deer or a coyote. And I don't think it wanted us to leave. It was the summer of 2018, and I was 25 years old when I decided to take a break from the daily grind. I just wrapped up a particularly brutal few months at work, and a weekend camping trip in the remote woods of northern Wyoming seemed like the perfect escape. A quiet weekend by myself, away from the noise, was exactly what I needed. So I packed my gear, rented an old, beat-up truck, and headed out. I had heard stories about this part of Wyoming. Stories about strange noises in the woods, whispers in the dark, and people going missing. But I didn't think much of it. People like to exaggerate, right? After all, it was just me, a tent, and a few supplies. I wasn't scared. I mean, I'd camped before, I'd gone hiking plenty of times. Nothing special. I found a remote spot by a little creek, the kind of place where the trees were dense, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. It was quiet, too quiet. The trees loomed overhead like silent giants, their leaves rustling faintly in the wind. As I set up my camp, something felt off, but I brushed it off. It was just the isolation. The feeling would pass once I had a fire going, I thought. By nightfall, the sky was clear, the stars bright against the blackness. I sat by the fire, eating a quick meal and watching the flames dance. I couldn't help but notice the stillness of the woods. No animals, no sounds of birds or insects, just the crackle of the fire. The isolation was starting to weigh on me a bit, but I tried to focus on the peace it brought. I was settling in, trying to enjoy the serenity when I heard it. A low, guttural sound coming from deeper in the woods. It was like a growl, but not from any animal I recognized. I froze, listening. There it was again. It was too deep to be a bear, too unsettling to be a coyote. It was something else. I stood up slowly, my eyes scanning the dark, trying to pierce the inky blackness beyond the light of my fire. The sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed a flashlight, shining it in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything. For a while, I stood there, fighting the instinct to bolt back to the safety of the truck. But then, I remembered what I'd come out here for. I wasn't going to let a sound scare me off. I sat back down, trying to dismiss the creeping unease that was slowly turning my stomach. Hours passed. The fire died down, and the night grew colder. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, and the strange growl seemed to come and go in the distance. It was always in the same direction, somewhere in the dense woods. My curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to check it out. Armed with nothing but my flashlight and a knife, I set off into the woods. The deeper I went, the more the woods seemed to press in around me. The trees were unnervingly close, their trunks twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I felt like something was watching me, waiting. Suddenly, the growl came again, but this time it was much louder, much closer. It was almost directly in front of me, just beyond the beam of my flashlight. My heart raced, and I took a step back, my eyes wide, straining to see through the dark. Then the light caught something. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mind, just a shadow in the corner of my vision. But as I focused, I saw it clearly. It was a figure standing motionless in the clearing. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't quite human either. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long for a normal person. Its body was hunched, with uneven, crooked movements. Its skin was stretched tight across its bones, and its eyes were black, empty pits. Couldn't look away. I should have run. I should have screamed, but I was paralyzed. The thing just stood there, staring at me with its hollow eyes. Then it made a sound, like the crackling of dry leaves underfoot. It took a step toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural, like something that didn't quite belong in the world. A wave of terror washed over me, but my feet refused to move. I tried to force myself to turn around, to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, caught in the thing's gaze. I don't know how long we stood there, but the moment felt like hours. Finally, it made another sound, something like a cough or a rasp, like a sickly human voice. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the darkness. I snapped out of my stupor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My legs finally gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how I managed it, but I forced myself to get up and run back to camp. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't even bother packing up my things. I grabbed the flashlight, the knife, and my keys, and I bolted for the truck. The whole time, I felt like something was following me, its presence just behind me in the shadows. I could hear it, a dragging, shuffling sound, like the thing was still out there, just waiting for me to make a mistake. When I reached the truck, I fumbled with the keys, my hands too shaky to get the door open. Finally, I managed to get inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I started the engine, not caring that the truck sputtered and groaned. I threw it into drive and sped off, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, hours away. My heart was still racing, and my mind was still spinning. I couldn't shake the image of that thing. Its long limbs, its hollow eyes, the way it moved, like something that didn't belong in the world. I haven't been back to those woods since that night, and I never will. Some things are best left in the dark, where they belong. I was 29 when it happened, and I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. It's not the kind of thing you just forget, not when it makes your skin crawl every time the thought sneaks back into your head. It was 2016, early autumn, that time of year when the nights get colder, but the days still feel like the end of summer. The leaves were turning, the air smelled damp and earthy, and the forests were quiet except for the occasional bird call or the rustling of something moving through the undergrowth. I had gone camping alone, something I'd done plenty of times before. I liked the solitude, the escape from work and people and noise. I had picked a spot deep in the Lake District, far enough from the usual hiking trails that I wouldn't have to deal with anyone stumbling across my campsite. I wanted to be alone. That was the whole point. I parked my car in a small lobby off a narrow road, packed my gear, and hiked in about 4 miles. The forest here was dense, mostly pine and some scattered birch, and the terrain was uneven, with small hills and patches of rock jutting out from the earth. I had my GPS, but I also had a map and compass just in case. No phone signal this deep in, which was expected. I found a small clearing near a slow-moving stream and set up camp. The ground was dry, the trees blocked most of the wind, and there was enough space for my one-man tent and a small fire pit. It was perfect. The hike had been tiring, but in a good way. My muscles ached, and I looked forward to just sitting by the fire with a meal and a book before turning in for the night. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, cooked some food, and listened to the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful. I slept well. The second day, I spent my time exploring. I walked further into the woods, following the stream, making note of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. I found a fallen tree covered in moss, a cluster of mushrooms growing at its base. I saw deer tracks in the mud near the water. Everything felt untouched, wild, and I loved it. I didn't see another person all day. That night, things changed. I had just settled in by the fire, my headlamp casting a dim glow over my lap as I read. The fire crackled softly, and the air was crisp. I felt completely alone, until I didn't. It started with a feeling, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, like you're being watched. I tried to shake it off. I was in the middle of nowhere. There was no one here, but I couldn't shake the unease. It was quiet, too quiet. I turned off my headlamp and let my eyes adjust to the dark. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see nothing, just darkness. But then I saw him. He was standing just beyond the firelight, maybe 20 feet away. A man, just standing there, half hidden behind a tree. My breath caught in my throat. He wasn't moving. He wasn't saying anything, just watching. I sat completely still, my heart hammering against my ribs. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was another camper. Maybe he was lost. But he didn't call out. He didn't step forward. He just stood there. I reached slowly for my knife, keeping my movements controlled. I wasn't going to panic. Not yet. And then he moved. Not towards me, not away. Just shifted slightly, like he was adjusting his stance. Like he had been standing there for a long time. I felt sick. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask who he was or what he wanted. I just stared, and he stared back. I couldn't see his face clearly. The firelight didn't reach him enough, but I could tell he was wearing dark clothes, something loose-fitting. His posture was relaxed, too relaxed, like he wasn't concerned that I had seen him. Then, after what felt like forever, he took a slow step back into the darkness, and another, and then he was gone. I sat there, gripping my knife, listening, my ears strained for any sound, any movement, but there was nothing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up by the fire until the embers died, then stayed in my tent with my knife in my hand, listening. Morning came. The woods felt normal again, but I didn't. My skin crawled, and my brain kept replaying the image of that man standing there, watching. I should have packed up and left. Any normal person would have, but part of me didn't want to let fear dictate my trip. I told myself it was just some hiker, maybe a poacher, someone who hadn't expected to see me and had frozen up. It made sense. It was logical. I forced myself to stay. That was a mistake. The third night was worse. I built my fire bigger than before, hoping the light would keep anything or anyone away. I forced myself to eat, to act normal, but the feeling of unease had settled deep in my bones. I stayed alert, listening. Around midnight, I heard something. Not footsteps, not breathing, but movement. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through the leaves. I gripped my knife so tightly my hand ached. The sound came from the trees, not far, maybe 30 feet away. I couldn't see anything past the fire's edge. And then it stopped. Silence. I held my breath. Then a twig snapped. Closer. I shot up, shining my headlamp towards the noise. Nothing. But I knew he was there. I didn't sleep. I sat awake until dawn, every muscle in my body coiled tight, every sound sending a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my gear. I didn't eat. I didn't take my time. I just packed and left. The hike back to my car was the longest 4 miles of my life. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every shift in the trees made my stomach twist. I felt exposed, like something was just out of sight, following me. When I reached my car, I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sat there, gripping the steering wheel. My hands were shaking. I didn't look back. I just drove. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe he was just some man who lived out there, some hermit or poacher or lunatic who didn't like strangers in his woods. But I do know one thing. He wasn't surprised to see me, and that means he was already there, waiting. It had been a long week of work, and I was craving some solitude. I hadn't gotten out into nature for a while, and something about the crisp autumn air just felt right. A camping trip was exactly what I needed to clear my mind. The opportunity to disconnect from the noise of everyday life, from the constant barrage of emails, calls, and the overwhelming pull of social media. So when my friend Jason suggested we head to an old camping spot he'd been to before, I didn't think twice. The place was deep in the woods, secluded, and perfect for getting away from it all. He talked about it often, but I hadn't been able to join him before. This time, though, everything lined up perfectly. We packed up our gear and set out, heading toward the remote area that Jason had described. It was a 3-hour drive out of town, followed by a good hour of hiking along a narrow trail that seemed to fade deeper and deeper into the forest. I'd been to some remote places before, but this spot felt different. There was an eeriness about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Jason didn't seem fazed, though. He was used to the isolation. The hike was exhausting, but the quiet of the woods was almost soothing. It wasn't the usual chirping of birds or rustling of leaves. It was something more subdued, the kind of quiet that settles in when you're too far from civilization. A slight unease settled in my chest, but I pushed it aside. I chalked it up to my overactive imagination. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to set. The camp spot Jason had described was right next to an old graveyard, though it wasn't like any graveyard I'd ever seen. It looked abandoned, neglected, with graves that hadn't been cared for in decades. Some of the headstones were cracked and leaning, others were barely visible, overgrown with weeds and creeping ivy. Jason was already unpacking the gear, and I followed suit, setting up the tent. The wind had started to pick up, and the trees creaked ominously as the night slowly enveloped the forest. It wasn't long before I noticed a slight chill in the air, despite the fire we'd managed to get going. By the time night had fully settled, the graveyard seemed almost to loom over us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, though Jason was totally at ease. He seemed to relish in the isolation. I, on the other hand, kept glancing at the shadows between the gravestones. They were shifting in strange ways, casting long, distorted shapes in the firelight. Felt like something was watching, waiting. We ate our dinner by the fire, the crackling of the logs the only sound breaking the silence. Jason tried to talk about the old cemetery, telling me how it had been abandoned for decades after a plague had swept through the area. Most of the townspeople had left, but some had stayed behind, and over time, the graveyard became forgotten. "You can't even find this place on most maps anymore," he said. picking at his food. It's like the world just moved on, you know? Like it never even existed. I nodded, but I wasn't paying much attention. I kept staring at the shadows around the graveyard. The wind was picking up, whistling through the branches of the trees, but something else, something quieter, was there. I couldn't explain it. As the night deepened, the chill in the air became sharper, more biting. Jason suggested we take a walk to stretch our legs, but I hesitated. The thought of wandering near those graves didn't sit well with me. Still, he seemed so relaxed that I reluctantly agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and walked toward the graveyard, our boots crunching on the dry leaves as we moved. The graveyard was even more unsettling up close. The stone markers were weathered and broken, some lying flat against the ground, others standing at odd angles. A few graves were almost entirely obscured by the thick undergrowth, and the air around us felt dense, heavy. As I walked past one of the gravestones, I couldn't help but glance at the name carved into it. Margaret Bellamy, 1853 to 1876. It was strange. The grave looked as though it had been disturbed recently, with fresh dirt piled around it. I pointed it out to Jason, but he only shrugged. Probably just some curious hikers or locals, he said dismissively. It's been a long time since anyone's really come out here. I wasn't convinced. There was something about it that felt off. I turned to look at the other graves, and that's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or the way the shadows played tricks on my eyes. But then I saw her again, a figure standing at the far end of the graveyard, partially hidden behind a large, overgrown gravestone. Her pale face, framed by dark, matted hair, was barely visible in the dim light. Her clothes were ragged, and she seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze, heart pounding. My breath caught in my throat. "Jason," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "There's someone there." Jason followed my gaze, and for a moment he just stood there, staring. Then, without saying a word, he began walking toward her, as if it was nothing out of the ordinary. "Wait, Jason. Don't..." I began, but my words were cut off by the sound of a sudden, loud crack. It was as if the air itself had been shattered. A huge gust of wind blew through the graveyard, knocking a branch loose from a nearby tree. It hit the ground with a loud thud, and for just a second, the figure moved. She didn't walk. She seemed to glide, disappearing behind another grave. Jason, ever the skeptic, muttered something under his breath and continued his approach. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but I was too terrified to move. "Hey!" Jason called out, his voice carrying across the graveyard. "Who's out here?" There was no response. The wind picked up again, stronger now, but the graveyard was silent. Not a bird, not a rustle of leaves, just the low hum of the wind in the trees. "Jason, we need to go," I said, my voice shaky. "This isn't right." But he didn't listen. He took another step forward, and that's when I saw it. The figure wasn't alone. Standing in the shadows just beyond the first figure was another shape. It was taller, more imposing, and it moved toward Jason with an unnatural speed. I felt my heart slam against my chest, and I screamed, "Jason, get back!" But it was too late. The second figure reached out, and I heard the sickening sound of something heavy hitting the ground. I bolted toward him, panic surging through me, but when I reached his side, I stopped dead. Jason was lying on the ground, unconscious, his face pale and bloodied. I dragged him away from the graveyard, fumbling to get him back to camp. My mind was racing, but all I could think about was getting out of there. By the time we reached the campsite, the night had gone still. The fire had nearly burned out, and the forest around us felt suffocating. I managed to get Jason into the tent, but I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I stayed awake the entire night, my flashlight scanning the perimeter, jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, Jason woke up groggy and confused. I didn't tell him everything. Couldn't. I didn't want to scare him more, but I could see in his eyes that something wasn't right. He kept looking at me, asking what had happened, but all I could say was that we should leave. And leave we did. I didn't look back as we packed up the campsite and started the hike back. But the entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Even when we reached the trailhead, I couldn't get the image of that pale, ragged figure out of my mind. We got back to the car, and as soon as the doors slammed shut, I felt a brief moment of relief. Jason still seemed dazed, but I didn't care. All that mattered was that we were out of there. I never went back to that graveyard. Never. And while I tried to explain to myself that it was probably just some people messing around or some trick of the light, I knew deep down what I had seen. It was real. Too real. As for Jason, he never spoke of that night again. But sometimes, when we're together, and he doesn't know I'm looking, I see him glance out of the corner of his eye, like he's checking to see if something is following us. I think he knows too. It was the beginning of October when I decided to take some time off from the usual grind. The weather had cooled down, and the leaves were beginning to turn amber and gold. The crisp air felt like a fresh start. I packed my camping gear and drove north, hoping for a peaceful weekend in the woods. I'd gone camping plenty of times before, but something about the quiet of the remote forest always gave me a feeling of solitude that I loved. The campsite was an hour or so into the woods, off a winding, narrow road. I didn't expect anyone to be out there, especially not on a Friday evening. It wasn't the most popular spot. It was too far off the beaten path. Perfect for what I wanted. Peace, quiet, and no interruptions. My car bounced along the rough road as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. I could smell the damp earth already. By the time I arrived, twilight had descended, the sky a blend of purple and orange. I pulled my car into the clearing and started to set up. The air had a chill to it, the kind that crept into your bones as night approached. I unpacked my tent, set up the campfire, and started to gather some firewood. The crackling of the fire was the only sound around me as I worked, the quiet of the forest pressing in. As the fire grew, I threw on a couple of logs, and the flames danced higher, sending a warm glow over the clearing. I was about to open my backpack to grab a book when something caught my eye. There was movement among the trees just beyond the fire's reach. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else, but the shape didn't seem quite right. It was tall and thin, standing still, watching me. I froze, unsure of whether I should call out or ignore it. The figure didn't move for a long while, and the forest remained silent, save for the crackling fire. My instincts told me something was off, but I couldn't quite pinpoint what. After a few minutes, I tried to shake off the feeling. I wasn't out here for anything strange. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I leaned back against a log, trying to focus on the fire. Then, just as I was about to turn my attention away completely, the figure stepped forward. It moved quickly, too quickly for a human. It was like it was gliding over the forest floor, its legs almost floating above the ground. My heart raced. I couldn't make out any details. The shadow was too dark against the night, but I knew that whatever it was closer now. I stood up, trying not to make any noise. My breathing felt too loud in the stillness of the forest. I slowly backed toward the car, my hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight in my pocket. The figure didn't advance any further, but it didn't retreat either. It simply stood there, unmoving, as if it was waiting for me to make the next move. I was torn between getting into the car and leaving or staying to figure out what was going on. but something inside me told me to leave. My gut was telling me that this wasn't a normal encounter. I grabbed my gear and threw it into the car as quickly as I could. The figure stayed at the edge of the trees, watching, unmoving. I didn't take my eyes off it as I started the engine. I felt the car's engine roar to life, and as I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure right behind me. But there was nothing. The forest was empty. I drove back down the winding road, my hands tight on the wheel. The sense of unease didn't leave me, but I tried to focus on getting out of the woods safely. The whole experience felt unreal. Had I imagined it? Was it just the shadows playing tricks on me? I ended up at a small diner, a place I passed often when I'd been camping out this way before. It was the kind of place that was always open late, with coffee that smelled like burnt caramel. I ordered a cup and sat down by the window, trying to shake off the tension in my shoulders. The waitress was friendly, asking me about my night, but I didn't mention the strange encounter. No one would believe me anyway, and I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. The last thing I needed was to be labeled paranoid. But as the night went on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. What had I seen out there in the woods? It didn't feel like an animal, and it definitely wasn't another camper. The way it moved, the way it stayed still and then seemed to glide toward me, it was too odd, too unnatural. I left the diner around midnight, feeling exhausted but unsettled. I decided to try a different spot in the woods, one that was a little further out, hoping for a peaceful night away from whatever had been in the forest earlier. I found another remote camping area. Quiet, isolated, and perfect. This time, I made sure to park my car out of sight of the road, deep in the trees. I set up my tent and started a fire again. The familiar crackling of the flames did little to ease the anxiety that lingered in my chest. But nothing happened that night. No figures, no strange movements. I slept fitfully, half expecting something to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, I woke to a bright, crisp day. The sun had risen, and the woods seemed peaceful again. There was a sense of relief that washed over me as I packed up my gear, ready to leave. But as I reached for my backpack, something caught my eye. On the tree nearest to my tent, something was carved into the bark. It wasn't deep, but it was clear. A single symbol, a circle with a line through it. I had no idea what it meant, but it was enough to send a chill up my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me the whole time, and worse, that someone was still out there. I left the campsite that morning, not looking back. The drive back to the city was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the woods. I told myself it was just my imagination, but part of me knew I'd never go back to that place again. There was something about it, something wrong. It wasn't the kind of place you should visit alone, and I never did. I don't know who or what I encountered that night, but I know I was lucky to get out of there when I did. The woods are quiet, but sometimes they can hide things you're better off not knowing. The rain had been falling for hours when I first noticed something was wrong. At first, it was just a distant feeling, a tickle in the back of my mind. You know, the kind of unease you get when you're alone in the woods, surrounded by the constant drip of rainwater from the trees and the occasional snap of a twig. But after a while, it turned into something more tangible, something I couldn't ignore. I come to this spot for peace. That was the plan, at least. My cousin, Alex, had been pushing me for weeks to join him on this camping trip. "You need to get away from the city," he'd said. "The forest will clear your head. It's just us, the fire, and the stars. Trust me, it'll be great." I should have listened to my gut when I felt hesitant about the whole thing. I should have stayed in the comfort of my apartment, where the only thing that could keep me up at night was the sound of traffic below. But I didn't. I packed my bags, grabbed my tent, and drove out to the remote campsite deep in the woods, far away from any other campers. It was the kind of place you find by accident. No well-traveled trails, no markers, no signs. Just the deep thrum of nature, the smell of damp earth, and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. Alex had been here a few times before, scouting the area and marking out spots for quiet weekends away from everything. He assured me it would be the perfect spot for some time away from the noise of daily life. When we arrived, it was late afternoon. The forest looked untouched, like something out of a postcard. The tall, twisted pines loomed above us, their needles glistening with rain as the storm began to settle in. The air was cool, crisp, but not unbearable, and the clouds were thickening quickly as we unloaded our gear and set up camp. By the time the fire pit was ready and our tent was pitched, the rain began to fall in earnest. We huddled under a tarp, the crackling fire our only source of light. Alex cracked open a beer, and I, not much of a drinker, sipped on some tea, the warm steam rising up to meet my face. I was trying to enjoy the moment, but there was something about the stillness of the forest that made my skin prickle. Maybe it was the quiet that unsettled me. No wind, no birds, not even the usual chirping of crickets. I shook it off. It's just the weather, I told myself. The rain intensified as the night wore on. The crackling of the fire and the rustling of the leaves seemed to blend into one constant background noise. It wasn't long before I could barely make out the outlines of the trees in the growing darkness, the storm having swallowed up any trace of light from the outside world. My mind began to wander, picking at little details I had noticed earlier, like how the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. I kept thinking I heard something beyond the rain, something distant but unmistakable. Footsteps, maybe? A break in the otherwise steady patter of raindrops? But each time I looked up, I saw nothing but the dark silhouette of the forest stretching out beyond the fire's reach. I tried to ignore it. Then, around midnight, Alex got up to grab more wood from the pile. He made some noise, but it was drowned out by the relentless pounding of the rain. I stared into the fire, a dull, flickering warmth that contrasted sharply with the chill settling into the bones of the woods. I heard it again. This time it was clearer. A soft, rhythmic sound like someone walking on the wet leaves, the faintest crunch of twigs underfoot. I froze, straining my ears to hear more. There was nothing else, no other sound, no response to the storm. Just that odd, unsettling noise. I was being paranoid. My mind was playing tricks on me. I had to tell myself that. Still, the thought lingered. Alex came back to the fire and noticed my distant stare. He didn't say anything, just sat back down and stoked the fire, poking the logs to keep the flames alive. He'd always been the quiet one, content with the simple things, like camping and hunting. He didn't get spooked easily, and I didn't want to seem like I was being overly anxious, so I kept it to myself. For the next couple of hours, I tried to focus on the fire, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to grow. The wind picked up, and with it, the trees began to creak and groan in the night. The storm raged on, but it wasn't the storm that was bothering me. It was something else, something watching from the dark. By 3 a.m., Alex had fallen asleep, lying with his back against a log, a blanket draped over his legs. I was wide awake, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the fire's reach, I saw a shadow. It wasn't the shadow of a tree, and it wasn't from any movement in the branches above. It was solid, dark, a shape standing just beyond the clearing. For a moment, I thought it was an animal, a bear maybe, but then it shifted. It wasn't like the slow, deliberate movement of an animal. It was too quick, too human. I blinked, and when I looked again, it was gone. My heart hammered in my chest. I wasn't imagining things, was I? I shook Alex awake, but the fear in my chest kept me from speaking. He stirred, groggily lifting his head to look around. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He squinted into the rain, but there was nothing there, only the dark outline of trees stretching into the distance. "See what?" he asked, already yawning. There was something," I stammered. Alex didn't seem convinced, but he got up anyway, grabbing a flashlight and scanning the area. "Probably just a deer or something," he muttered. "It's late. You're tired." I didn't argue. I couldn't argue with him, not when he had no idea what I'd seen. We sat back down by the fire, but the tension between us was palpable. It wasn't just the storm now. It was something else, the sense of being watched, of being hunted. I felt the weight of it in my chest. Hours passed in silence. The rain slowed, but the night seemed to stretch on forever. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of the leaves, made me jump. But the longer I sat there, the more I began to realize something. There was no sound, no wind, no insects, no animals moving through the underbrush. The forest had gone completely still. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. It was low, labored, like someone trying to stay hidden. I couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, just that it was close, so close. My mind raced, heart thundering in my chest. I turned to Alex, but he was already fast asleep, completely unaware of the growing danger around us. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The forest around me seemed to close in, the shadows deepening, stretching, moving like living things. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I could feel the presence there, just on the edge of my vision. I took a few steps toward the edge of the clearing, holding my breath, trying to keep my footsteps light. And then I saw it, a figure, crouched low, barely visible in the dark. A man. His features indistinct, but his eyes wide and unblinking, locked onto mine from the shadows. The breath I'd been holding rushed out in a sharp gasp. The figure didn't move. He just watched me. I froze, my entire body tense, my legs shaking under me. There was no way this could be real. I had to be dreaming, right? But the weight of the moment, the cold air, the rain against my skin, it felt too real to ignore. I had to act. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, shining it directly at the figure. But it was gone. In a blink, the shadows swallowed him whole. I backed up slowly, my heart in my throat. I wasn't sure what I was afraid of, whether it was the figure itself or what it meant. I turned back to Alex, desperate to wake him. He was still asleep, blissfully unaware of the nightmare unfolding just feet away from him. The hours ticked by. The storm had finally stopped, but it had left an eerie calm in its wake. The silence was overwhelming. At some point, I must have drifted off, too exhausted to keep my eyes open. When I woke up the next morning, the sun had risen, but the forest felt wrong. The trees were still damp from the rain, the leaves still clinging to the trunks, but the air was still, too still. And when I looked around, I saw it just beyond the clearing where the man had been standing. There were footprints, fresh ones, but there was no sign of him. Alex woke up a little later, stretched, and sighed. "Good morning, kid. You sleep all right?" I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. We packed up camp quickly and left the forest without another word. I didn't want to stay there another minute. We didn't talk much on the drive home, and I didn't bother to explain what had happened. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. Not to that forest. Not to that place where the air was too quiet, where shadows had a life of their own. Whatever was out there wasn't something I wanted to meet again. And I knew, deep down, that I wasn't just being paranoid. I'd seen him, and he had been watching. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea. Maybe I wanted a story to tell, something to look back on and laugh at. Maybe I just wanted to test myself, to see if I could sit in the dark, in a place meant for the dead, and feel nothing. It started as a passing idea, camping in the old graveyard on the outskirts of town. It wasn't a big cemetery, just a few dozen scattered graves, some so old the names had worn off the stone. Most of the people buried there had lived and died long before my time. I wasn't superstitious. There were no legends about the place, no stories of hauntings or strange disappearances. It was just a forgotten patch of land with broken headstones and overgrown grass. I packed light, a tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a small cooler with some snacks, and my knife just in case. I had camped alone before, mostly in the woods, but this felt different. There was no cover here, just open land with graves scattered around like jagged teeth. It was too far from town for anyone to bother me, but that was part of what made me uneasy. I parked my car along the dirt road, a few hundred yards from the cemetery. I didn't want to pull in too close, just in case someone happened to drive by. I wasn't sure if camping there was illegal, but I didn't want to take any chances. The sun was already setting as I set up my tent. The sky was smeared with red and orange, and the air had that crisp bite that came with early autumn. The grass was damp under my boots, and the ground was uneven, dipping and rising where old graves had sunk into themselves. I found a relatively flat spot near the edge of the graveyard, away from the more weathered headstones. By the time I finished setting up, the last bit of sunlight had disappeared. The dark settled in fast. My flashlight cut through it in a weak, narrow beam. I turned it off after a while, letting my eyes adjust. The stars were bright, and the moon was nearly full, casting a pale glow over the land. I sat on the ground, leaning against a tree just outside the cemetery fence, eating a sandwich. The night was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of traffic, just stillness. The first noise came about an hour in, a soft crunch like someone stepping on dead leaves. I turned my head sharply, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I told myself it was just the ground settling. Maybe an animal, a raccoon or a stray cat. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the branches above me. I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. A little past midnight, I decided to try and sleep. I zipped myself into my tent and pulled my sleeping bag over me. The ground was hard, the cold seeping through the thin fabric beneath me. My body was tired, but my mind was awake, hyper-aware of every sound outside. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again, closer this time. A footstep, a single, deliberate step. I froze. My heartbeat thumped against my ribs. I waited, straining my ears. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining it. But then another step came, closer. I held my breath, gripping my knife in my sleeping bag. My flashlight was next to me, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. The sound came again, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, just outside my tent, I heard the faintest whisper of fabric, like someone brushing past my tent flap. My skin went cold. My grip tightened on the knife. I waited, my body tense, listening, but there was nothing else. No retreating footsteps, no further movement, just silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in place, my mind racing through possibilities. Eventually, exhaustion won over fear, and I must have drifted off. I woke up at first light. The sky was gray, the sun barely creeping over the horizon. My body ached from sleeping on the hard ground. I unzipped the tent cautiously, peering out. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. My car was where I left it. everything was the same. I almost convinced myself it had been a dream, that I had imagined it in the haze of exhaustion. But as I packed up, I noticed something strange. One of the old gravestones near my tent had been disturbed. The grass around it was flattened, and the dirt near the base looked shifted, like someone had been digging. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed my things, walked to my car, and left. I never went back, and I never found out what or who had been there with me that night. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. It was my husband's idea to go camping that summer. His mother loved the outdoors, and he thought it would be nice for us to get away from the noise of the city and spend some time together. I agreed, though I wasn't particularly excited. I didn't grow up camping, and sleeping outside with all the unpredictable things that could happen never really appealed to me. But I didn't argue. It was only for a weekend, and I told myself it would be fine. We picked a quiet, remote campsite in the mountains of Montana. My husband, Mark, had been there before with his family when he was younger. He assured me it was beautiful. Dense trees, a nearby river, and not many people around. That last part made me uneasy. I liked the idea of privacy, but being too far from other people also meant that if something happened, we'd be on our own. The drive was long, nearly 6 hours from home, and the last stretch was a winding dirt road that led us deep into the forest. The farther we drove, the more I felt the isolation settle in. Trees pressed close on either side, their thick branches blocking out the sky. The road was narrow, and we barely saw another car the entire way. When we finally arrived, the sun was dipping low behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing where we set up camp. The site was simple, just a fire pit, a small wooden table, and enough space to pitch our tents. There was no cell service, no nearby ranger station, and no other campers that we could see. We worked quickly to set up before it got dark. Mark handled most of it, pitching the tents while I helped and unload the supplies. She moved with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. I envied that. She hummed softly as she organized the food and set up the camping stove, completely at ease in the wilderness. By the time we finished, the night had fully settled in. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant rush of the river. The forest was eerily silent. I expected to hear crickets or the occasional hoot of an owl, but there was nothing, just a heavy stillness, as if the trees themselves were listening. We ate in relative peace, though I couldn't shake my unease. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving in the darkness beyond the fire's glow. But there was nothing, just trees stretching endlessly into the night. After dinner, Mark and his mother sat by the fire, talking and reminiscing about past trips. I listened but found myself distracted, my eyes drifting toward the blackness beyond our camp. The feeling of being watched crept over me, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I excused myself and crawled into the tent, hoping sleep would come quickly. The fabric felt thin, barely a barrier between me and whatever was out there. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was safe. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned low, casting weak, flickering light through the tent walls. I listened, holding my breath. First, there was nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. Then I heard it, faint crunch, like a footstep. I froze. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. An animal, maybe, a deer wandering close to camp. But something felt wrong. The sound was deliberate, slow. Not the careless movement of an animal, but something or someone trying to be quiet. I turned toward Mark, but he was still asleep. I didn't want to wake him. Not yet. I strained to listen, my pulse hammering in my ears. Another crunch. Closer. I swallowed hard. My fingers trembled as I reached for the flashlight beside me. I clicked it on, aiming the beam toward the thin mesh opening of the tent. Nothing, but the woods beyond the tent were dark. Too dark. The fire had died down almost completely, leaving only a few glowing embers. I could barely make out the shape of Anne's tent a few feet away. Then, another noise. Closer this time. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. Then something moved. A shape just beyond the dying fire. Person. They stood at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the faint light. My stomach dropped. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I wanted to scream, to wake Mark and Anne, but my throat felt tight, locked in fear. Then, slowly, they moved back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I sat frozen for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it been real, or just a trick of the light? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every small sound made me jump, my heart pounding against my ribs. I wanted to wake Mark, to tell him what I saw, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the nagging doubt that I had imagined it. When the first light of dawn crept over the trees, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The woods no longer felt like they were closing in, but the unease didn't fade. I stepped out of the tent, my body aching from staying tense all night. Mark and Anne were already awake, boiling water for coffee. They looked well-rested, normal, as if nothing had happened. I glanced toward the edge of the trees, where I had seen the figure. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. But I knew what I saw. I didn't say anything. Not then. I didn't want to sound paranoid. We spent the morning as planned, eating breakfast and preparing for a short hike. I forced myself to act normal, but every time I glanced toward the trees, I felt the same unease creeping in. By midday, we were deep into the forest, following an old trail that wound through the trees. The farther we walked, the more isolated I felt. It was supposed to be peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Then I saw it, a small clearing just off the trail. At first, it seemed unremarkable, just another break in the trees. But then I noticed the remnants of a campfire, and beside it, something worse. Pile of bones. Not animal bones. They were small, scattered, picked clean. My stomach turned. I looked at Mark and Anne, but they hadn't noticed yet. I hesitated, debating whether to say something. Then I heard it, a rustling in the trees, and I knew without a doubt that someone was watching us. I didn't say a word. I turned back to the trail and kept walking, forcing myself to act normal. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if they were still there. I had always liked the idea of camping alone. Something about being out in the wild, away from the noise of the world, made me feel like I could breathe. I wasn't the type to be scared of the dark or the sounds of the forest at night. I'd done enough solo camping trips to know that most of the time, what you hear rustling in the underbrush is just a fox or a raccoon. Nothing to be afraid of. This trip was meant to be like any other. I had planned a 3-night stay deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, a place I'd been before but never alone. The last time I was here, I had gone with a couple of friends, but this time, I wanted to take it slow, enjoy the solitude, and just be away from everything. Work had been stressful, life had been tiring, and I needed a break. The drive up was long, nearly 5 hours, but the deeper into the wilderness I got, the better I felt. The roads narrowed, the trees thickened, and soon I was on a dirt road that led to a trailhead. The air smelled damp and clean. It had rained earlier in the day, and the clouds still hung low, making everything feel still and quiet. I parked my truck in a small clearing near the start of the trail. There was no one else around. I took my time unloading my gear, strapping on my heavy backpack, making sure I had everything I needed before locking up the truck. I always made a mental checklist before heading out: tent, sleeping bag, food, knife, flashlight, spare batteries. I wasn't careless. The hike to my campsite was about 4 miles in. The trail was mostly flat, winding through tall pines and thick underbrush. I didn't see any other campers, which wasn't unusual. This area wasn't one of those popular campgrounds where people brought their kids and set up in big groups. It was a place for people who wanted to be alone. It was late afternoon by the time I reached the spot I had in mind. A clearing just big enough for my tent, right near a slow-moving creek. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood for a fire, and settled in for the evening. The first night was uneventful. I ate a simple meal, sat by the fire until it burned down, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the sound of the water. I woke up early the next morning, feeling well-rested. The air was cool, and the forest was still damp from the rain the day before. I spent most of the day hiking around, taking in the quiet, enjoying the feeling of being disconnected from everything. I didn't see a single other person, which I liked. As the sun started to set, I made my way back to camp, got another fire going, and cooked dinner. It was peaceful. I thought about staying out here longer than 3 nights. Maybe an extra day wouldn't hurt. Then, just as I was getting ready to turn in for the night, I heard something, a branch snapping, not far from my campsite. I wasn't immediately alarmed. Deer moved through these woods all the time, and I'd seen signs of them earlier in the day. But then I heard another sound, footsteps, slow, deliberate. I sat completely still, listening. The footsteps stopped. The fire crackled. The creek moved, but everything else was silent. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal. Maybe my imagination. I had been alone for a while after all. But as I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, I felt uneasy. I kept my knife close and my flashlight within reach. I told myself to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. The night passed without incident. When I woke up, the forest felt normal again. The sun was shining, birds were calling from the trees, and the uneasy feeling from the night before seemed silly. I spent the day fishing at the creek, enjoying the solitude. I almost forgot about what I had heard the night before. That night, as I sat by the fire again, I felt better. I told myself it had just been an animal. Then, as I was about to put out the fire and head into my tent, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, measured, coming from the trees beyond my campsite. I stood up, gripping my flashlight and my knife. I shined the light into the darkness. The trees stood still, nothing moved. Then something caught my eye, a figure just beyond the edge of my firelight. Standing, watching, couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person, unmoving, silent. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring. And then, slowly, they stepped back into the darkness. I waited, listening. Nothing. No more footsteps. No sound at all. I should have packed up and left right then. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just a shadow. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my tent, gripping my knife, every sound making my heart pound. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside, scanning the trees. Nothing was out of place. No tracks. No signs that anyone had been there. I forced myself to stay calm. It was my last night anyway. I would leave in the morning. That night, I didn't make a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I just sat in my tent, listening. And then, around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. Breathing, right outside my tent. Slow, heavy. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just gripped my knife and waited. The breathing stayed there for what felt like hours. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. I didn't sleep. As soon as the first light of dawn hit, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. My hands were shaking. As I made my way back to the trail, I kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. I wasn't alone. I reached my truck, threw my gear inside, and drove. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing. I won't be camping alone again. It was the middle of October when I decided to take a trip up to the woods. The weather had cooled off, and the air smelled of pine and earth. The sort of cold that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, but you're still comfortable enough to want to get out there and experience it. I had always been one to enjoy the quiet of nature, the simplicity of just sitting by a fire with nothing but the sound of the wind and the occasional rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. My friends Liam, Dave, and I had talked about camping in the mountains for years. Finally, after too many months of pushing the trip back, we all agreed that we were going to do it. The spot we picked was a secluded place near the Wyoming border, close to the kind of woods that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. Thick forests, winding roads, and barely any signs of civilization for miles. The perfect getaway, or so I thought. We arrived at the spot just before dusk. The trees stood tall, their shadows stretching across the forest floor. There was a creek nearby, its water flowing with a soothing rhythm. We set up camp quickly, unrolling the tents and starting a fire to keep the cold at bay. The smell of burning would fill the air as we sat around the fire, talking and joking. It wasn't until the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the sky turned dark that things started to feel off. The first sign that something wasn't quite right came when Dave went to fetch more firewood. He walked off into the trees, just a few feet from the clearing, where the darkness swallowed up everything beyond the reach of the firelight. He had been gone for maybe 10 minutes, but I was starting to feel a little uneasy. Liam noticed it too. "Where's Dave?" he asked, peering into the darkness. I shrugged, trying not to let the creeping feeling take over. Probably just grabbing more wood. He's fine. Another 5 minutes passed, then 10. Still no sign of Dave. By now, the firelight flickered as the wind picked up, sending embers flying into the air. The silence of the woods was heavy, thick. It wasn't like the usual stillness I was used to. There was something unnatural about it. Finally, I stood up. "I'm going to check on him," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Liam didn't argue. "All right, but be quick." I grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the edge of the clearing, where the trees seemed to consume the light. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping back and forth in an attempt to find any sign of movement. I didn't want to call out for him. It felt wrong, like I might alert something I didn't want to find. As I ventured deeper into the trees, the air grew colder. I reached the spot where Dave had gone for the firewood, but there was no sign of him. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, but no fresh footprints, no sign that he had even passed this way. My heart began to race. I called his name softly, not wanting to break the eerie silence more than I had to. "Dave!" Nothing. I pushed forward, deeper into the woods now, the flashlight beam barely cutting through the growing darkness. The trees were taller here, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The wind picked up again, but it was colder now, and it carried an unfamiliar scent. Something musty, like rotting wood. Then I saw something. A figure. I froze. It was a shadow moving among the trees. Tall, thin, not Dave. The figure moved quickly, darting between the trees in a way that didn't seem natural. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my breath coming out in shallow, panicked gasps. I didn't know if I should follow it or run, but something in me pushed forward, urging me to figure out what the hell was going on. I followed the shadow until it disappeared behind a large rock, and that's when I heard it. A low, raspy sound, a sort of scraping noise coming from behind the rock. My flashlight beam swung wildly, landing on a dark shape huddled just out of reach of the light. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it. Dave's body was lying there, half hidden behind the rock, his eyes wide open in shock, his face pale as death. Blood stained the leaves around him. The sight of him, of what had happened to him, hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered back, my mind struggling to comprehend the horror in front of me. My throat felt tight, and my body froze. My breath came out in short, shallow bursts as I tried to make sense of it all. I turned, my mind racing as I ran back toward the camp. But then I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Someone was following me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my legs pumping, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. It wasn't until I reached the clearing and burst into the light of the fire that I dared to stop and catch my breath. Liam was sitting by the fire, looking at me with confusion. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice shaking with worry. I didn't have words. The only thing that came out of me was a strangled gasp. I looked around, half expecting to see whatever was in the woods with me emerge from the trees. The night felt too still, too heavy. "Dave," I managed to choke out. "He's dead." Liam's face drained of color. He stood up quickly, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What happened? Where is he?" "I don't know," I gasped. "But there's something in the woods. Something wrong." We both stood there for a moment, the crackle of the fire the only sound between us. We couldn't just stay there. I knew that now. Something was out there, something we couldn't understand. And it wasn't just a bear or some wild animal. This was different. We had to get out, but getting out wasn't as easy as it seemed. As we started to pack up, I heard something in the trees, a twig snapping, followed by another. I could feel the tension in the air thickening, like something was about to happen. We grabbed what we could, the urgency of the situation overwhelming. We weren't thinking clearly. We needed to leave before whatever was out there came for us. But just as we were ready to head back to the truck, we heard a voice. It wasn't Dave's voice. It was a deep, gravelly sound, too low to be human. "Run," it hissed. We froze, paralyzed with fear. The voice came from all around us, echoing through the trees. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. That was when we finally did what we should have done hours ago. We ran. We didn't stop until we were back at the truck, the engine roaring to life as we sped out of the woods and into the night. The whole way back, we didn't say a word, our minds too occupied with what had just happened. We never spoke about it again after that. I don't know what happened to Dave that night or who or what was out there with us in the woods. But I know this, we were lucky to get out. And I'll never go camping in the mountains again. Not after that night. It started with a weekend trip. A few days off, a stretch of woods by a lake, and a plan to clear my head. I had spent the last 6 years as a cop, and the job had started to wear me down. The endless calls, the paperwork, the shift rotations, the things I had seen, things I couldn't unsee. Camping had always been my way of stepping back, letting the quiet settle into my bones. This time I went alone. Normally, my cousin or a friend from work would come along, but everyone had other plans. I didn't mind. The thought of silence, of nothing but the wind and the water, was exactly what I needed. I packed light, just a tent, some food, and my knife. I picked a spot deep in the woods, a few miles from a lake I had visited once before. It wasn't a marked campground, just a clearing with enough space for a fire. No one around for miles. Perfect. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, spilling orange light between the trees. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I set up my tent, collected some wood, and got a small fire going. The forest felt alive, but in a distant way. Birds calling from high branches, the rustle of underbrush as something small moved through. I ate, stretched out by the fire, and let my mind go blank. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it. A crack in the darkness, a branch snapping under weight. I sat up, listening. Could have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. I had my knife nearby just in case. I waited. The fire had burned low, throwing long shadows. Another sound, closer this time. A step. Deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing. The undergrowth stood still, untouched. I wasn't scared. I had seen worse things than the dark. Still, I kept my knife in my hand and stayed awake for a while longer. When nothing else came, I let myself lie back down. The next morning was calm, bright. Sunlight pushed through the trees in thick beams. I let the night's unease fade. Maybe I had imagined the footsteps. Maybe it was just the woods playing tricks. I spent the day hiking, cutting through trails that barely existed. The land here was untouched, wild. I liked that. By the time I got back to camp, I was exhausted. That night, the fire burned hot, cracking and spitting embers into the dark. I ate, stretched my legs, and listened to the quiet. Then it came again. The sound. A step. Then another. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. The firelight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows. I saw movement, a shape just beyond the glow of the flames. I stood, my knife in my grip. The shape didn't move, just a figure standing still, watching. I spoke, but the woods swallowed my words. No response. I stepped forward, and the figure shifted, slipping back into the dark. I moved fast, my flashlight cutting through the trees. Nothing, just emptiness where someone had stood. I circled my camp, scanning every shadow, every break between trees. No footprints, no signs of anyone passing. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out here. Someone was watching. I barely slept. Every noise kept me awake. Every creak of the forest made my muscles tense. Morning came slow. The fire had burned out. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. I checked my surroundings, looking for any sign of tracks, any hint that what I had seen was real. Nothing. I should have packed up. I should have left. But something in me wanted to stay. A part of me needed to know who was out there. I spent the day walking the perimeter of my camp, looking for anything out of place. Then, a mile from my sight, I found it. A cabin. It was old, nearly swallowed by the forest. The wood was gray, eaten by time. The windows were black, empty. No signs of life. No smoke from a chimney. I approached slowly, every instinct in me awake. Sharp. I tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, dust covered everything. The smell of rot and old wood filled the air. There were footprints in the dust. Fresh. I scanned the small space. An old stove, a broken chair, a table with deep scratches across the surface. Then I saw it. A knife, still sharp, resting on the table. And next to it, a police badge. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands. I knew the name, Officer Ryan Galloway. He had gone missing 6 months ago. I had worked the case. He had been on patrol one night, responding to a call near the outskirts of town. His car was found abandoned on a dirt road. No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing. He had just disappeared. And now his badge was here. A noise. Behind me. I turned fast, my knife ready. The door stood open. The woods beyond, dark and waiting. I left the cabin, moving slow, controlled. I followed the footprints leading away from the door. They curved through the trees, deeper into the forest. Then they stopped, just ended. No signs of struggle, no other tracks, just gone. I stood there for a long time. Then I went back to camp. I packed up fast. I didn't stay another night. I never told anyone what I found. I filed my report like everyone else, listing Galloway as missing, his case unsolved. But I knew the truth. He was out there, or someone wearing his face was. And whoever it was, they had been watching me, waiting. I was camping alone in the French countryside, deep in a remote forest that stretched for miles. It was late September, the kind of season where the warmth of summer still lingered during the day, but the nights carried a chill that settled deep in the bones. I had driven from my home in the UK, eager to spend a week away from the noise of daily life, away from people. I wanted isolation, the kind you only find when the nearest town is a long drive away, and your only company is the rustling of leaves in the wind. I had picked a small clearing by a quiet lake, where the trees framed the water like an untouched painting. I set up my tent near the shore, just close enough to hear the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. There was no one else around. I hadn't seen another person since I had left the last paved road, navigating narrow dirt paths that seemed forgotten by time. It was exactly what I wanted. For the first couple of nights, everything went as expected. I spent my days hiking, following old trails that wound through the trees, sometimes stumbling across abandoned structures, remnants of old farms, half-collapsed stone buildings being swallowed by nature. The nights were colder than I had anticipated, but my gear was good, and I enjoyed the feeling of being truly alone, with only the crackling of my campfire to break the silence. But then, on the third night, something changed. I had gone to sleep as usual, wrapped in my sleeping bag, the tent zipped up tight. The night air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a fox or a deer moving through the underbrush. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it was footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal. These were slow, deliberate. I stayed completely still, my breath shallow, ears straining. The steps came closer, moving through the trees just beyond my tent. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the way the leaves crunched underfoot, the occasional snap of a twig. Someone was out there. I didn't move. I didn't even reach for my flashlight. I just lay there, heart pounding, listening as the steps circled my campsite. Whoever it was, they didn't speak. They didn't call out. They just walked, slow and steady, like they were studying my setup. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the steps retreated, fading back into the trees. I stayed awake for hours, gripping the small knife I kept in my bag, listening for any sound of return. But there was nothing. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and scanned the area. There were footprints in the dirt, large ones. They circled my camp and led back into the trees. I followed them a short distance, but they disappeared into the underbrush. There were no signs of where the person had gone or how far they had traveled. I considered packing up and leaving, but I had spent too much time planning this trip, and a part of me tried to convince myself it had been nothing. A hunter, maybe, or some local wandering through. Besides, they hadn't done anything. They had just walked around. If they had wanted to harm me, they could have. So I stayed. The day passed without incident. I forced myself to enjoy the quiet, to push aside the unease that sat heavy in my gut. But when night fell, that feeling came creeping back. I made sure my fire was burning bright before I went to bed. The warmth comforted me, but I still kept my knife within reach. I don't know what time it was when I woke up again, but the fire had died down to embers, and the air was thick with silence. Then I heard it, breathing. It was faint but unmistakable. Slow, measured breaths, just outside my tent. I froze. The tent fabric was thin. If I moved, if I made a sound, they would know I was awake. My mind raced. I pictured someone standing just inches away, their face inches from the fabric, listening. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then the breathing stopped. A rustling sound followed, and then footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, my decision was made. I was leaving. I stepped out of the tent, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the clearing was empty. The only evidence that anyone had been there was a single footprint, pressed deep into the dirt just outside the entrance to my tent. I packed quickly. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to be gone. The drive back through the narrow dirt roads felt agonizingly slow. Every twist and turn in the road felt like it could hide someone watching. I didn't stop until I reached the first real town. I never found out who it was. Maybe I never want to. It was a late autumn weekend, and my husband, Tom, and his mother, Janet, convinced me to join them for a camping trip in the dense woods near the outskirts of Wyoming. I'd never been much of an outdoors person. I'm more of a city girl, but I agreed to tag along, hoping it might be a good way for us to bond. Tom and Janet had always been close, and I wanted to get to know her better, so despite my reservations about the isolation, I packed up and went along. The drive there was long and winding, the road stretching for miles through forests of towering pines and endless fields. The landscape was breathtaking in its own way, but it felt increasingly isolated the further we went. Tom kept the mood light with his stories about past camping trips, but Janet, who was in her late 50s, sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window. There was something unsettling about her silence, but I brushed it off as just her way of relaxing. By the time we reached the campsite, it was late afternoon. The sun had already begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. We were deep in the woods now, far from any town or civilization, and that quiet, almost oppressive silence of nature surrounded us. I felt it creeping in, that sense of being watched, but I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to sound like I was overthinking it. Tom set up the tent with ease. He'd grown up camping and hiking with his father, so this was second nature to him. Janet helped with the firewood. Though she didn't say much, her face etched in concentration. I, on the other hand, was hopeless with anything that required manual labor. I set about unpacking the food, trying to distract myself from the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere. It wasn't until nightfall that things started to feel off. The air grew colder as the evening wore on, and I noticed that the woods around us seemed unusually still. The only sound was the occasional crackling of the campfire and the distant rustle of leaves in the trees. As the firelight flickered, I caught glimpses of shadows moving at the edge of the camp. I convinced myself it was just the wind, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I glanced at Janet, who was staring into the fire, her face unreadable. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom looked up from where he was adjusting the fire and shook his head, a grin on his face. "It's just the usual night sounds. Don't worry about it." But the more I listened, the more I realized that there was something else, something different, a faint rustling, almost like footsteps, not far from the camp. I tried to push it from my mind, telling myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon. As the night deepened, the woods seemed to grow darker. The shadows that had once been cast by the fire now took on a life of their own, stretching out across the campsite in strange angles. My nerves were on edge, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I looked over at Janet again, hoping to see some sign that she was picking up on the same weirdness, but she still sat motionless, her expression blank. "You okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a murmur. Janet didn't respond. She just kept staring into the fire, her gaze distant. It was like she was lost in thought or maybe something else entirely. I wasn't sure, but it unnerved me. As the evening wore on, Tom and I stayed up for a while, chatting and trying to enjoy the fire. Janet had retreated to her sleeping bag early, claiming she was tired. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the longer we stayed up, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every little sound, every crackle of the fire, seemed to send a jolt through me. I suggested that we turn in for the night, and Tom agreed. We doused the fire, though the lingering smell of smoke still hung in the air. As I settled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, I found it hard to relax. I could hear the wind picking up, whistling through the trees. But there was something else, something faint, just beyond the reach of the wind, a sound that made my skin crawl, a soft thud, followed by another. It was coming from the direction of the trees, a steady, rhythmic sound that I couldn't quite place. My breath caught in my throat as I listened more intently. The sound was getting closer. I nudged Tom, who was already drifting off to sleep, but he didn't stir. I sat up slowly, straining my ears. There it was again, a thud, and then something that sounded like a scraping noise, like nails against wood. My heart started to race. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that filled the tent. What was that noise? It wasn't just the wind. It was too deliberate, too unnatural. I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself that it was just an animal. But my instincts were telling me otherwise. This was different. It wasn't right. After what felt like hours, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I quietly unzipped the tent and stepped outside, trying not to disturb Tom. The cold air hit me instantly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I crept toward the edge of the campsite. The woods were pitch black, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The only light was from the faint glow of the dying embers of our campfire. I felt like I was being drawn into the darkness, each step pulling me farther from the safety of the tent. The rustling noise was louder now, much clearer. It was coming from behind a large cluster of bushes, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I moved closer, my breath catching in my throat. The closer I got, the more I felt like something or someone was watching me. My heart was thudding in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what it was. And then I saw it, a figure crouching low, barely visible in the shadows. It was a man, but something about the way he moved was all wrong. His limbs jerked in strange angles, his movements erratic, like he was trying to hide but couldn't quite get it right. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could see his eyes. They were wide open, unblinking, staring directly at me. I froze. My blood ran cold as I stood there, locked in place, unable to move. I didn't know what to do, couldn't breathe. Everything in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The figure moved again, this time stepping into the dim light. He was tall, unkempt, and dirty. His clothes were ragged, torn in places. But it was his eyes that caught my attention, wild and unfocused, like he wasn't entirely there. Before I could react, he suddenly turned and darted back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared. I don't know how long I stood there, completely paralyzed, but eventually I forced myself to move. I ran back to the tent, my heart pounding in my ears. I shook Tom awake, panic rising in my chest. "There's someone out there," I gasped, my voice trembling. Tom looked at me, groggy and confused, but there was a flash of concern in his eyes. He quickly stood up, grabbing a flashlight and pulling on his shoes. Janet, hearing the commotion, finally stirred from her sleeping bag. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and alert as she looked between Tom and me. "Stay inside the tent," Tom ordered, his voice calm but firm. I nodded, unable to speak. I had no intention of leaving the safety of the tent. I watched from the flap as Tom stepped outside, shining the flashlight into the dark woods. I could hear him calling out, but there was no response. The rustling had stopped. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Tom came back inside, shaking his head. "I couldn't find anything. It must have been an animal or something. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. It wasn't an animal." The rest of the night passed in eerie silence. I stayed awake, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't trust the woods anymore. I didn't trust the darkness that surrounded us. Something was out there, something that wasn't supposed to be, and I wasn't going to let my guard down again. The next morning, we packed up and left early, the sun barely rising over the horizon. Janet didn't say much, but I noticed that her eyes kept darting around, as if she was looking for something or someone. I never told Tom about the figure I saw in the woods. He wouldn't have believed me, but I didn't need him to. I knew what I saw. We never went camping in those woods again. The memories of that trip haunted me for a long time, and sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear the faintest rustle of leaves, like something or someone is still out there, waiting. After the divorce, I needed some time to myself. The mess of the past year, constant arguments, the legal battles, and the exhaustion had left me drained. It was August, the heat of summer still hanging in the air, but I figured the woods would offer me some peace. I decided to go camping alone. No one to answer to, no one to disturb my thoughts. I chose a remote spot near the edge of the Pacific Northwest. There's something eerie about those dense forests. The way the trees grow so thick they block out most of the light, even in the middle of the day. The campsite I found was isolated, far enough from civilization that no one would wander in. A small lake sat just beyond the clearing, its surface always calm, except for the occasional ripple from a fish jumping or the wind picking up. I set up my tent in the late afternoon, the shadows already stretching long by the time I finished. I didn't have much with me, just the basics. A small stove, a few cans of food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a lighter. I wasn't going to be there for long. A weekend, maybe, just long enough to get my head straight again. The first night wasn't so bad. It was quiet, the kind of quiet where the absence of noise starts to feel like it's pressing in on you. But I was used to that kind of silence. It wasn't like I had much of a choice anyway. My mind kept drifting back to my ex, to all the things I couldn't change, but it was easier to push those thoughts away in a place like this. The rustle of the trees, the occasional call of an owl, those things helped. But around midnight, things started to feel off. At first, I couldn't pinpoint why. It was just this nagging feeling, like I was being watched. I'd grown up camping, so I knew the forest could play tricks on you. The wind can make strange noises, branches can creak, animals rustle through the leaves. Still, this was different. It wasn't just the sounds. It was the sensation of something being out there in the dark. I'd made a fire earlier, and it was still burning low when I decided to take a walk. I needed to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and left the camp, walking towards the lake, keeping the beam of light scanning ahead of me. The darkness felt thick, like it was swallowing everything. The trees, the ground beneath me. It all seemed to absorb the light, leaving me with only the small circle in front of me. I didn't know what it was at first, just a shape, darker than the surrounding shadows, blending in with the forest. I'd stopped walking, my heart suddenly picking up its pace, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. A deer, maybe, or a bear. The wildlife here was abundant, and I had no intention of getting close to anything dangerous. But the figure didn't move. I stood there for a long time, watching it, my breath caught in my throat. It was standing at the edge of the forest, just out of range of my flashlight. I could make out some details now, tall, broad-shouldered, and unnervingly still. It looked human, but there was something wrong with it. The way it stood, too rigid, almost unnatural. My instinct screamed at me to go back to camp, but I stayed rooted to the spot. A part of me wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It had been a rough year, and the solitude was starting to get to me. I convinced myself it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. I turned and started walking back, keeping my eyes on the spot where the figure had been. I quickened my pace, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. When I finally got back to camp, I didn't feel much relief. I kept checking the tree line, my eyes darting around, but there was nothing, no sign of whatever I'd seen. I stayed up for a while, staring into the fire, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. Eventually, I forced myself to lie down in my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle in the trees, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. By morning, I was exhausted, but I had convinced myself that whatever had happened was just my mind overreacting. I spent the next day fishing at the lake, trying to put my worries behind me. It was easier during the day. The sun was out, the birds were singing, and the peacefulness of the lake helped me calm down. But as night fell again, I couldn't shake the feeling. My sleep was fitful, and by the time the moon was high in the sky, I was wide awake. I heard something then, not the usual sounds of the forest, the wind in the trees, the distant calls of animals, but something different, something deliberate. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just an animal again, but they didn't sound like that. They were too heavy, too human. I held my breath, straining to hear, but the sound stopped. My heart pounded in my chest. Had it been a person? I grabbed the flashlight and shone it through the opening of the tent. There was nothing, just the trees, the same empty silence. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A footprint, right outside my tent. It was large, and the soil around it was disturbed, as if someone had been pacing around my campsite. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. Should I stay in the tent and wait for morning? Should I try to leave? I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching me. I spent the rest of the night sitting up, my flashlight in hand, staring into the darkness. By morning, the footprint was gone. The campsite was eerily quiet, as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't forget it. Something wasn't right. I packed up and left the next day, but the unsettling feeling didn't leave me. On the drive back home, I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone out there in those woods. Something or someone had been watching me, and I knew deep down that I had only just scraped the surface of whatever it was. The forest had left its mark on me, not just in the form of a few sleepless nights, but in a way that felt like it would linger with me forever. I never really thought of myself as someone who would end up out in the middle of nowhere, in a place as desolate as this. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine trees. All around me, the night settled in quietly, the only sounds being the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant call of an owl. It was the kind of quiet that swallowed everything, the kind that made you feel small and insignificant. I had agreed to take this solo camping trip on a whim, Maybe it was because life back in the city had gotten too overwhelming. Work, noise, people, and just the constant hum of life that never let you rest. A break from all of it was what I needed, so I packed my gear, hopped in my car, and drove for hours until the road turned into gravel, and the trees closed in around me. This place, hidden deep in the forest, was the perfect spot to disappear. It was around 8 p.m. when I finally set up camp. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting everything in a cool blue light. I built a fire, the crackling flames giving me a small sense of comfort, though it wasn't much. The shadows from the trees stretched long and ominous, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I was used to camping, had done it countless times before. I wasn't some city dweller who got freaked out by a few trees, but there was something different this time. It wasn't the typical peace that came with being alone in nature. There was an edge to the silence, a tension in the air that I couldn't place. I sat near the fire for a while, roasting a marshmallow and staring into the flames. The wind picked up, rustling the branches overhead. That's when I heard it, a low, distant noise that cut through the night like a blade. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks with the trees. But then it came again, louder this time. A thud, followed by a dragging sound. I stood up quickly, heart thumping. My eyes scanned the darkened forest. There was nothing, only the trees, the shadows, and the wind. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was too deliberate, too heavy. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and pointed it toward the noise. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the underbrush and the trunks of the trees. Nothing, just the eerie quiet of the forest. I turned back to the fire, trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe I had watched too many horror movies in my life. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. I made my way back to my tent, setting the flashlight down by the entrance. I crawled inside, zipping the flap tight. The air inside the tent was stuffy, but it was better than being out there in the dark. I lay down, staring up at the mesh ceiling, trying to push the unsettling noises from my mind. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound outside had me on edge. The wind, the crackling of branches, the occasional rustling of leaves. Each one felt like it was part of something bigger, something I didn't understand. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, a louder thud, followed by the dragging noise. This time, it was much closer. I froze, my heart racing. The noise was unmistakable, like something heavy was being dragged along the ground, coming closer and closer to my camp. I grabbed my flashlight again, unzipping the tent flap just enough to stick my head out. The beam of light cut through the trees, but there was nothing. The forest was still, too still. My mind raced. Should I pack up and leave? Should I stay and wait it out? I didn't want to be the person who abandoned their camp at the first sign of danger. But the growing sense of dread in my gut told me this wasn't just a normal night in the woods. I stood up and grabbed my knife just in case. The last thing I wanted was to find out the source of that noise was something, or someone with ill intentions. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, keeping the flashlight in front of me, scanning the forest line. The fire had burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow. As I walked, I kept my eyes on the shadows, my mind working overtime to come up with a rational explanation. But everything felt off. The air was too thick, the silence too heavy. Then I saw something, a flash of movement. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But when I turned to look, I realized it wasn't. It was a figure, barely visible in the dark, moving slowly toward me. I froze, my hand tightening around the flashlight. The figure wasn't large, but its movements were deliberate, as though it knew I was watching. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person, at least not like any person I'd ever seen. The dragging sound grew louder as the figure came closer, and that's when I saw what was happening. The figure was dragging something behind it, a heavy object that scraped across the ground with a sickening rhythmic sound. My stomach churned, and my throat went dry. I wanted to turn and run, but my body refused to move. I was paralyzed with fear, my eyes locked on the shadowy figure as it came closer and closer. The dragging sound was now almost deafening, but there was still no other noise, no footsteps, no rustling, just the eerie scrape of something heavy on the forest floor. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It was as if it had heard me, or maybe it had seen me, couldn't tell, but I could feel its presence now, looming in the darkness, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, unsure of what to do next. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, separated by the darkness, neither one of us moving. Then, without warning, the figure turned and vanished into the trees. The dragging noise slowly faded, and the forest fell back into its unnerving silence. I stood there for a moment longer, waiting for any sign that it was safe to move. But nothing came. The forest remained still. There was no sound except the wind. It wasn't until I finally dared to take a step back toward my tent that I realized just how close I had come to whatever was out there. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I didn't know what I had just witnessed, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I spent the rest of the night in my tent, the flashlight beside me, my knife in my hand. Sleep didn't come. I couldn't close my eyes for fear that I would wake up and find whatever it was standing over me. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my camp in a hurry. I didn't care about the mess I was leaving behind or how much I was rushing. All that mattered was getting out of there. The drive back to the city was a blur, the road stretching endlessly in front of me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. The forest, whatever it was, could keep its secrets. I wasn't sticking around to find out. And as I drove away, I felt something I hadn't felt before: relief. It was early autumn in the Adirondacks, around 9 p.m. when I arrived at the small, rustic cabin I had rented for the weekend. The air smelled like wet leaves and damp earth, the scent of the forest so thick it almost felt like you could taste it. The day had been gray and rainy, and though the downpour had slowed to a steady drizzle, the ground was soft and muddy beneath my boots as I made my way to the cabin. I was here to get away from the city, clear my mind, and maybe do a little hunting if I could catch sight of something. I'd been hunting on and off for years, but lately, with work piling up, I hadn't had the time to focus on anything but the grind. The cabin was a small, one-room affair, built out of logs with a steep, moss-covered roof. A wood stove sat in the corner, and a heavy cast-iron pot hung over it, though I had no intention of cooking anything tonight. I was alone, just me and my gear. No friends, no family, just the sound of rain tapping on the roof and the occasional rustling of leaves outside. I wasn't exactly a stranger to the wilderness, but something about the isolation of the place unsettled me. There was no real phone signal, and the nearest town was a good hour's drive away, which left me feeling both free and a little trapped. The only noise in the area was the occasional crack of a branch in the woods, and tonight, with the rain softening the sounds of the forest, it seemed like the silence was almost too much. I set my gear down inside, slinging my rifle over the chair near the door, and made a quick sweep of the cabin. The windows were small, so the place felt dark even with the lamp I'd lit on the table. I made sure the door was locked, though it seemed unnecessary, Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere on a night like this? As I sat down by the fire, warming my hands, I thought about how peaceful it would be to just sit here all weekend, away from everything. No emails, no phone calls, no distractions. Just the sound of the rain and the crackling fire. But as the night wore on, that peace slowly started to feel more oppressive, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I hadn't expected to hear anything outside, just the usual animal noises that you get in the woods, like the wind moving through the branches or the occasional owl hoot. But then I started hearing something else, a soft rustling at the edge of the trees, faint but distinct. My first thought was it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but it wasn't quite the rhythm of a deer moving through the brush. It was slower, more deliberate, and somehow more human. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe a tree branch had fallen and was brushing against something else. But that feeling, the one that tells you something isn't right, kept creeping into the back of my mind. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. Maybe an animal in the shadows. The light from the cabin barely reached the tree line, and the rain had turned the dirt path to a slippery mess. I made my way slowly to the edge of the forest, trying not to make any noise. There was nothing at first, just the wet earth beneath my boots and the occasional drip of water falling from the leaves above. But then I heard it again, the sound of something moving through the trees, but it wasn't right. It was too slow, too heavy. I froze, listening. The wind shifted slightly, and I could hear something moving just a little further up the trail, maybe 30 or 40 yards from me. It was close enough that I could feel my heart start to race, but far enough that I couldn't see anything. I didn't know what to do. I had the rifle, but I wasn't about to start firing blindly into the woods. That could end badly in any number of ways. For a while, everything went silent. I stood there, in the dark, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was nothing.
No rustling.
No crackling leaves. I even took a cautious step forward, and the wet ground muffled any noise I made. And then, just as I started to turn back toward the cabin, I saw it, a figure tall and thin, stepping out of the shadows of the trees. It wasn't moving in any particular direction, just standing still, looking at me. I couldn't make out any details in the dim light, but the figure didn't look like any animal I knew. It wasn't even the shape of a person, exactly, but it had that presence to it, an unmistakable shape that felt wrong. My breath caught in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it disappeared back into the woods, moving so fast it didn't seem possible. One moment it was there, and the next there was nothing. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was racing with every possible explanation, but nothing made sense. I hadn't heard a thing. There hadn't been any branches breaking. It was like the figure had melted into the darkness. I stayed outside for a little while longer, not sure what I was waiting for. The rain was getting heavier again, and the wind was starting to pick up. But no more movement, no more sounds. Eventually, I gave up and retreated back to the cabin. It felt like an eternity before I managed to fall asleep that night, the sound of the rain on the roof mixing with the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I tried to convince myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew that I hadn't. The next morning, I woke up to find everything outside blanketed in fog, the trees and rocks barely visible through the mist. I didn't feel like hunting anymore. There was something in the woods, something I didn't understand. And no matter how hard I tried to shake the feeling, it wasn't going away. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to distract myself with chores around the cabin. I split some wood, cleaned the stove, and even boiled some coffee on the fire. But every time I looked outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Later that afternoon, I decided to head into town. I needed a break, some human contact. Maybe I was just tired from the drive. Maybe I hadn't slept enough. I packed up my gear and headed out, but the drive felt different now. The road, which had seemed so familiar just days before, now felt like a maze, like the forest was closing in around me. The more I drove, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting for me. As I passed the last of the tree line and got closer to the town, the tension slowly started to ease. By the time I reached the diner, I could almost breathe normally again. I stayed for a while, grabbed a coffee, and just watched the rain fall outside. But even in the warmth of the diner, I couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't until I was headed back to the cabin, still trying to push the unease from my mind, that I realized just how wrong things had gone. I turned off the main road and back onto the trail that led to the cabin. The closer I got, the more I felt it, a deep, unsettling sense of dread. When I reached the cabin, I parked and got out, noticing immediately that something was different. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it like that. Cautiously, I approached the door, rifle in hand. The place was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. The cabin was colder than usual, and there was a feeling of heaviness in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the next few hours carefully going through the cabin, checking the locks, double-checking the windows, but nothing had been stolen. No signs of forced entry. Still, something was wrong. Something had changed while I was gone. It wasn't until later that night, as I was sitting by the fire trying to calm down, that I saw it. The figure again, standing just outside the cabin, barely visible in the shadows. It was watching me, but this time I didn't run. I didn't feel that rush of fear. Instead, something in me snapped. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. The figure stepped back into the darkness as I approached, but this time, I was ready. I wasn't going to let it disappear. I followed it into the woods, through the dense trees and underbrush, deeper than I'd ever gone before. The figure was always just out of reach, leading me somewhere I couldn't yet understand. I wasn't sure what I was going to find, but I was determined to find out. It was the end of September when I found myself alone in the woods. A last-minute camping trip, just to get away from the grind of city life. I had always enjoyed the isolation the forest offered, but something about that weekend felt different. The chill in the air, the thick, heavy clouds hanging low, and the uneasy quiet that seemed to blanket the forest. It all made my skin crawl. I hadn't expected the weather to turn so fast. When I set out, the forecast had been clear. The sun was shining bright, and I was looking forward to a peaceful, quiet weekend of hiking and camping. But now, the first raindrops were starting to fall, slow at first, then quicker, until the sky opened up and drenched everything in sight. The trail had been long, and by the time I reached my campsite, the rain had picked up, falling in sheets. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. I was soaked to the bone but grateful to finally have a place to set up camp. I threw on a rain jacket and got to work pitching my tent and starting a small fire. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the sound of distant thunder that rumbled ominously across the valley. I had camped here many times before. This particular spot was secluded, nestled in a small hollow, with a nearby creek that trickled in the background. Felt like the perfect place to unwind. I sat by the fire, drying off my clothes as I listened to the rain beat against the canvas of my tent. The fire crackled, its warmth a small comfort in the otherwise cold and damp night. As the hours passed, the storm grew worse. The rain was relentless, falling harder and harder, the wind picking up to a point where the trees began to sway dangerously. It wasn't just the weather that felt off, though. Something in the woods felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the tension in the air, but every crack of the fire and every gust of wind had my nerves on edge. By the time it was dark, the storm was at its peak. The rain was nearly blinding, and I could hardly see the trail to the nearby cabin where I had planned to rest for the night. I'd forgotten that I wasn't entirely alone in the area. There was a small hunting cabin a few miles down the path, rarely used except for the occasional weekend trip. The idea of trekking through the woods in such a storm didn't appeal to me, so I decided to stay put. That was when I heard it. A soft thud came from the direction of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch falling from one of the trees. But then it came again, closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. A light tapping sound, like footsteps crunching on wet leaves. I stood up, straining my ears to listen. The rain drowned out most other sounds, but there it was again, definitive, unmistakable footsteps. Someone was out there, but who? I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent. The rain was still coming down in torrents, and the darkness felt all-encompassing. I swung the beam of the flashlight around, but the light barely pierced through the heavy downpour. Nothing. The woods were empty, but the footsteps, they weren't my imagination. Someone or something was out there. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I call out? No, that would be too risky. It could be a stranger, someone looking for shelter, or maybe someone with ill intentions. I had no way of knowing. So I did the only thing I could think of. I waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. The storm raged on, the rain falling harder than before, the wind shaking the trees. I had just begun to convince myself it had been a figment of my imagination when I heard it again. This time it was closer, and it wasn't just footsteps. It was a voice, a low, guttural growl, almost like a whisper, but it carried through the rain. My pulse quickened, and my instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of the woods and away from whatever was lurking out there. But I couldn't just leave. My car was parked miles away, and the path was too treacherous to navigate in the middle of a storm. I was trapped here, and the only thing I could do was stay alert. I waited by the fire, trying to steady my breathing, but the sound of the rain and wind only seemed to heighten the tension. It felt like something was watching me, waiting. The growl from earlier came again, but this time it was louder, more distinct. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly approached the edge of the clearing, where the woods began to grow thick and dark. My eyes scanned the area, but I couldn't see anything beyond the reach of the weak light. Then I saw it, a figure barely visible through the rain. It was hunched low to the ground, barely moving, but unmistakably there. My heart raced. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, but something was off about him. His movements were jerky and unnatural, like he was trying to remain hidden, like he was stalking something. I held my breath, praying he hadn't seen me. I stayed as still as possible, my heart thudding in my chest, watching as the figure slowly crept closer to the campfire. I wanted to run, to grab my things and make a break for it, but the fear kept me frozen in place. The man, if it was even a man, came closer, his eyes glinting in the dark, locked onto me. There was something wild about his expression, like a hungry animal, desperate for something. And then, without warning, he darted forward with unnatural speed, charging at me. I stumbled backward, my flashlight falling to the ground, the beam flickering wildly. The man, or whatever it was, closed the gap in an instant, his hands reaching out to grab me. In that moment, every muscle in my body screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Panic overtook me as his hand clamped down on my wrist, pulling me toward him with terrifying strength. I managed to break free, my heart pounding in my ears. I scrambled for the tent, hoping to get inside and lock myself away from whatever this thing was. But before I could reach it, I felt a sharp pain in my side. He had a knife and he had managed to catch me with it. I screamed, my vision blurring as I stumbled to the ground. The rain seemed to drown out everything except the pounding in my chest. My hand reached out, desperately searching for something, anything to defend myself with. And then I found it, a large, jagged rock, half buried in the wet ground. I grabbed it, hoisting it up with every ounce of strength I had left. I swung it with all my might, connecting with the side of his head. He staggered back, momentarily dazed, but his eyes never left me. They were filled with something cold, something calculating. I didn't wait for him to recover. I ran, my feet slipping in the mud, the rain pouring down harder than ever. My side ached where he had cut me, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I made it to the nearby trail, praying I wasn't too far from the cabin. The storm had masked the sound of my footsteps, and the figure didn't follow. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe, gasping in the cold air. I kept running, ignoring the sharp pain in my side. I had no idea where I was going, but I couldn't stop now. I had to get to safety. When I finally reached the cabin, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I could hear the rain hammering against the roof, but there was no sound of pursuit. I let out a shaky breath, my heart still racing. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours huddled by the fireplace, keeping the knife I had taken from the cabin within reach, just in case. The rain continued to fall, but the terror that had chased me through the woods had finally subsided. The next morning, when the storm cleared, I made my way back to my car, my mind still reeling from what had happened. I didn't dare go back to the campsite. I knew I would never return to that place. What I had encountered in those woods would stay with me forever, a nightmare that had come too close to being real. And when I got home, safe and sound, I never spoke about it again. Not to anyone, but I knew deep down that whatever it was in those woods was still out there. And one day it would come back. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a chance to reconnect with nature and escape from everything else. My wife, Laura, and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. It had been a stressful few months. Work, personal stuff, and just the usual grind of life. Laura's stepsister, Amelia, had recently moved into town, and we thought it would be a good idea to invite her along. She was the adventurous type, always up for something outdoorsy, and I figured having her along would be fun. We chose a remote campsite by a small lake tucked away in the woods. It wasn't on any popular map, which was part of the reason we picked it. The more secluded, the better, right? We packed up the truck with gear, food, and camping supplies, tents, sleeping bags, flashlights, a camp stove, and the usual necessities. The weather forecast was clear for the weekend, but as we drove further out into the mountains, the sky began to cloud over. I didn't think much of it, though. Rain didn't bother me, and I figured we could make the best of it. We arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, with the clouds growing darker as we set up. The lake was calm, the trees around us thick with pine and birch, felt peaceful, isolated, perfect for getting away. We set up our tents, started a fire, and settled around it, sharing stories and jokes as the night crept on. The temperature had dropped quickly, and the air had an unmistakable chill. It felt like a typical camping night, cool and crisp, the kind of night where you could hear every crack of the firewood and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Amelia seemed to be in her element, telling us about some of her hiking trips in the past. She had a wild energy about her, always moving, always speaking. It was as if she thrived in the wilderness. I couldn't help but feel a bit out of place, like I was just a spectator to her passion for the outdoors. I didn't mind, though. I was happy to let her take charge when it came to planning things like this. As the fire flickered and we ate our dinner, I noticed a strange feeling creeping in, something I couldn't shake off. It was hard to put into words, but the woods felt off, unnaturally quiet, even though the wind was picking up. I tried to ignore it, but every now and then, I'd hear a sound that didn't belong. Branches cracking, something heavy shifting in the underbrush. I brushed it off as an animal, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up just the same. Night fell quickly, and we settled into our tents to sleep. The wind howled outside, shaking the tent fabric, but we were warm enough inside. Still, that uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at me. I tossed and turned for hours, trying to ignore the occasional scraping sounds outside, like something was moving around the campsite. At one point, I heard something that sounded like a distant voice. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe someone else camping nearby. But there was no mistaking the soft, almost melodic quality to it. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamt of running through the woods, chasing something, or being chased. I couldn't tell. I woke up in a cold sweat, disoriented, heart racing. The night was still pitch dark, but the wind had died down. I could hear the faint sound of water lapping at the shore and the occasional hoot of an owl. I glanced over at Laura, but she was fast asleep, her breathing steady. Amelia, however, was gone. My stomach twisted. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it or if the sounds outside were getting to me, but it didn't make sense. Amelia had been asleep just a few hours ago, so where the hell had she gone? I crept out of the tent quietly, not wanting to wake Laura, and grabbed my flashlight. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe Amelia had gone to explore the woods, or maybe she just needed some fresh air. The campfire had long since burned out, leaving only the dim light of my flashlight to guide me. I stepped cautiously through the campsite, calling her name under my breath. No answer. I scanned the area around the lake, but everything was eerily still. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, and the ground was thick with fallen leaves. The sound of a twig snapping behind me made me freeze. My heart jumped into my throat. I whipped around, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. But there was nothing, just the wind, still gentle but persistent. I called out again, louder this time. "Amelia!" There was a long pause. I felt ridiculous. Maybe I had just imagined it. But before I could turn back to the tents, I heard something. A sound that made my blood run cold. A faint, high-pitched giggle, almost childlike, but unmistakably coming from the woods. I took a step toward the noise, my instincts screaming at me to stop, but my curiosity overpowered the fear. I moved deeper into the trees, pushing aside branches and undergrowth. The giggle sounded again, and this time, I heard the rustling of something moving quickly through the brush. I aimed the flashlight in that direction, but there was nothing, just shadows stretching across the forest floor. "Amelia!" I called out again, my voice thick with tension. No response. My flashlight flickered. I tapped it and it came back on, but the beam seemed weaker, as though something was interfering with it. I cursed under my breath. This was not normal. Something was wrong. My head was spinning with possibilities. Someone else was here. Someone who shouldn't be. Then the ground shifted under my feet. I stumbled and almost fell, but caught myself. Something caught my ankle. I looked down, heart pounding, only to see nothing but tangled roots and old underbrush. But there was something else now, a feeling that made my chest tight. I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on me. I turned quickly, my flashlight shaking in my hands. The trees were empty, just the shadows cast by the faint light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from just beyond the reach of the beam. I slowly backed away toward the campsite, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I needed to get back. Now, as I hurried toward the tents, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the clearing, tall, slender, and unnervingly still. The beam of my flashlight caught it for a split second, and I saw a flash of pale skin. The figure didn't move, but I could feel the weight of its gaze. Then it disappeared into the trees without a sound. My legs almost gave out beneath me. I didn't stop to think. I ran back to the tents, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the campsite, I found Laura still asleep, unaware of what had just happened. But Amelia was gone. I woke Laura and told her I couldn't find Amelia, that something was wrong. At first, she was groggy and confused, but when she saw the fear in my eyes, she got up immediately. We searched the campsite again, calling for Amelia, but she was nowhere to be found. We spent the rest of the night in a paranoid frenzy, checking every rustling bush, every shadow in the trees. But no one else came. We didn't hear the giggling again. By morning, the sky had cleared, but the weight of the night still hung heavy in the air. We packed up quickly, both of us too shaken to think clearly. As we made our way back to the truck, we found the remains of our campfire, the ashes still warm. And then, just past the fire pit, there was something strange. A set of footprints, barefoot, leading away into the woods. They were too small to be mine, and definitely not Laura's. But they didn't look like Amelia's either. They were irregular, almost like the feet had dragged across the ground, as if whoever had been walking had been stumbling. That's when I realized Amelia had been out there, yes, but she wasn't alone. Someone had been with her. Someone had made those footprints. We left the campsite as quickly as we could, driving off without looking back. What happened that night never really made sense to me. The footprints, the giggling, the figure in the woods. It all felt wrong. But we never saw Amelia again. She was never found. And to this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there that night, it was waiting for us to leave. The woods had been empty, but they weren't quiet. It was early autumn, and the last few weeks had been a blur of work, errands, and endless obligations. I needed a break, something to clear my head. That's when I decided to go camping, alone. I wasn't one for crowds or distractions, and with my dog, Scout, by my side, I figured we could both use the quiet. He was a mixed breed, a big guy with golden fur, strong legs, and a protective streak that always made me feel safer. I chose a remote campsite in the mountains, the kind where you had to hike in a bit to reach far enough from civilization that the sound of cars and people would be a distant memory. There were no crowds here, just the whisper of the wind and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. The trailhead was far from any towns, and cell service was spotty at best. I liked it that way. Felt like the kind of place where I could breathe again. We arrived just as dusk began to settle in, the sun dipping low behind the peaks. The campsite was perfect, nestled beside a small creek that babbled gently through the trees. I set up my tent quickly, the sounds of birds calling overhead and the smell of damp earth filling the air. Scout seemed at ease, trotting around the perimeter, sniffing everything in sight, his tail wagging in that calm, content way he had. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I built a small fire, the crackling flames casting long shadows against the trees. The sound of the creek, now muffled by the night, seemed distant and unimportant. It was just me, Scout, and the quiet of the forest. We sat together, me with a cup of hot coffee, Scout resting his head on my knee, watching the fire. The night was peaceful for a while, but then, as I settled back against the rock near the fire, I began to notice the quiet wasn't entirely complete. There was something just beyond the edges of my perception, something faint, almost imperceptible. A rustle in the leaves, the snap of a twig. could have been an animal, a squirrel, a deer, or something else. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. Scout, however, was standing up now, his ears perked, his body stiff. He let out a low growl, not loud, but deep and steady. "Easy, boy," I murmured, reaching down to calm him. But he didn't sit back down. Instead, he started to pace around the camp, his growl growing louder. His eyes were fixed on something in the dark, something just beyond the reach of the firelight. I looked in the same direction but saw nothing. The trees were thick, and the shadows were deep. Could have been an animal, but Scout was acting differently. He was tense, his body low to the ground now, his fur standing on end. I stood up slowly, my hand on the knife I'd kept in my pack. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I scanned the forest again. The rustling had stopped, but that feeling, that sense of being watched, hadn't. It hung in the air, thick and unnerving. I took a few steps closer to Scout, and when I did, I heard it again. This time, it was louder. A clear snap of a branch breaking underfoot. My heart skipped. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Something or someone was out there. Scout let out a sharp bark, then growled again, this time with more force. I felt a chill run through me. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something normal. My instincts told me to move toward the tent, to gather my things and leave, but that would have meant turning my back on whatever was watching me. And that wasn't a risk I was willing to take. I stood stock still, staring into the dark, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. I could hear the creek trickling softly in the background, but that was the only sound. The forest was holding its breath. Then, from the darkness beyond the campfire, I saw movement. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but there, something large moving between the trees, just out of the light's reach. Scout barked again, but this time, his voice was strained, anxious. I grabbed my flashlight from the ground and flicked it on, casting a beam toward the dark shape. It froze for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. For a split second, I saw it. A man, but not like any person I had ever seen. His clothes were ragged, his face obscured by the shadows, but I could see enough to know that he wasn't someone out here just hiking. He was too still, too unnatural. He didn't move like someone who belonged in the woods. I called to Scout, trying to keep my voice steady, but it cracked as I did. "Stay, boy," but it was too late. Scout was already moving, his legs tense, ready to charge. I didn't know if I was more scared of what was in the woods or what Scout might do. He had a protective side, but that sometimes made him unpredictable. The man stepped forward, and I could see his face clearer now. There was something wrong with it. His eyes were wide, too wide, his skin pale in the firelight. His mouth was slack, and his expression was twisted, like he was either deep in thought or lost to something else. I took a step back, trying not to show fear, but Scout wasn't listening anymore. He charged forward, barking furiously. I wanted to call him back, but I couldn't. The man was moving now, too, his eyes locked on Scout, and I had the sickening feeling that this was no accident. Whatever he was, he had been waiting for this. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest object I could, my camp axe, and held it up, ready to defend Scout. The man took another step forward, and Scout lunged. He collided with the man's chest, knocking him back a few feet, but the man didn't fall. Instead, he grabbed Scout by the scruff of his neck, his hands strong and quick. "Scout!" I shouted, running forward. But the man's grip tightened, and Scout let out a pained yelp, his body jerking in the man's hold. Adrenaline surged through me, and I swung the axe down, aiming for the man's arm. The blade struck his wrist, and he let out a grunt of pain, his grip loosening just enough for Scout to break free. The dog scrambled back, his fur bristling with fear and aggression. The man didn't seem to care about the injury. His eyes were fixed on me now, cold and calculating, and I could see something in his expression that chilled me to the bone. He wasn't just some lost hiker. He wasn't even human in the way I understood it. I didn't hesitate again. I grabbed Scout by the collar and dragged him toward the tent, shouting for him to follow, urging him to run. The man didn't chase us, but I could feel his eyes on us as we retreated. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows, but there was no time to think. We had to get away. Inside the tent, I zipped it shut and double-checked that the lock was secure. Scout was panting heavily, his eyes wide with anxiety. He kept looking at the entrance as if expecting the man to appear at any moment. I tried to calm myself, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my phone, trying to get a signal, but there was nothing, no bars. The phone was useless. We were completely alone. The rest of the night passed in a tense, unbearable silence. I stayed awake, my eyes fixed on the entrance, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Every rustle outside made me jump, but nothing came closer. Scout remained at my side, alert, watching the world outside, his protective instincts still on high alert. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I cautiously unzipped the tent. There was no sign of the man, no footprints, nothing to show that anything had happened the night before. The forest was still untouched, as if it had all been a bad dream. But it wasn't. I packed up quickly, not bothering to eat or waste any time. Scout kept his usual pace, but I could feel his tension. He had been my protector last night, and I wouldn't have made it through without him. We hiked out of there as fast as we could, the sense of unease never fully lifting. But by the time we reached the trailhead, the world felt safer again, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I couldn't explain what had happened or who that man was, but I knew one thing for certain: whatever it was, I wasn't going back to that campsite. And neither was Scout. We made it to my car, the doors clicking shut behind us. The forest was behind me now, but the memory of that night, of the man, would stay with me for a long time. And Scout, always by my side, would be there to protect me, no matter what came next. The storm had been relentless since early evening, pounding the campground with sheets of rain. I wasn't prepared for how quickly it would shift from a mild, breezy summer night to this brutal downpour. I had planned for a quiet weekend, maybe with a little bit of hiking and cooking over the fire, but now, the rain had ruined any thoughts of enjoying nature. I had chosen this camping site for the solitude. There's something special about being out in the middle of nowhere, with no one around, just you and the wilderness. A small lake lay a mile down the path from the camp, and there were dense woods all around. The campsite had a single, slightly worn-down cabin for rent, something rustic but functional. I had the entire spot to myself, the only company being the sound of wind rattling through the trees and the occasional crack of thunder in the distance. The plan was simple: set up camp, enjoy a few quiet hours, then sit by the fire when it got dark. But the storm had thrown a wrench into that. By 8:30 p.m., the rain was unyielding. There was no way I was going to sit outside and freeze. I retreated to the cabin to try and salvage the evening, lighting a few candles for ambience and pulling out a deck of cards. A few hours passed, and with every hour, the wind seemed to pick up, rattling the old windows of the cabin. I had heard that there were wild animals in these woods, deer, coyotes, maybe even a bear or two, but I had no real concerns. My cabin was on a secluded road, far from the main highway, so I felt safe enough. The night had already started to stretch long, and I was considering getting some sleep when a sharp noise outside grabbed my attention. At first, I thought it was just a branch from one of the trees falling under the weight of the rain. But then I heard it again, closer this time, A distinct crunch followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. I froze, my heart leaping in my chest. Someone or something was out there. I stood motionless for several long seconds, straining my ears to hear any more sounds. But the rain had drowned out everything but the roar of the storm. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly opened the cabin door. The cold air hit me like a slap, and the rain soaked my clothes immediately. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the tree line. I didn't see anything at first, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. I walked cautiously to the edge of the cabin, scanning the woods. My mind was racing. Could have been another camper, I told myself. Or maybe some animals had wandered into the area. But deep down, I knew that it didn't feel like either of those things. There was something wrong about the way the footsteps had sounded. Too deliberate, too controlled. I was about to turn back when a shadow caught my eye. Standing in the middle of the muddy road that led to the cabin was a man. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes dark and heavy with rain. His posture was rigid, as if he had been standing there for a long time. I couldn't see his face clearly, but there was something off about the way he stood. Still and unmoving, not reacting to the rain or the wind at all. I couldn't explain why, but every muscle in my body tensed. I hesitated, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I trained the beam on him. He didn't flinch, didn't move. There was something unnerving about how he seemed to be just staring at the ground, his back straight and rigid. I called out to him, but the wind swallowed my voice, and he didn't even acknowledge I was there. My instincts screamed at me to go back inside and lock the door, but for some reason, I didn't. I moved slowly toward the road, each step feeling heavier than the last. The man didn't shift, didn't turn to acknowledge me. My mind raced. Who was he? What was he doing here, alone, in the middle of a storm? There were no other campsites for miles. No roads that led to any nearby towns. I had driven out here alone and hadn't passed another car for hours. Where did he come from? I called out again, louder this time. Hey, are you okay? Still nothing. Just that eerie, unnerving stillness. I took another step forward, the mud making my boots sink with each movement. The man's figure didn't waver. My heart was pounding in my chest, the sound of my breathing now loud in my ears. There was something wrong here. The air felt thick with an unspoken tension. I was close enough now to see him more clearly. His face was covered by the hood of his rain jacket, but the features that I could make out were gaunt, drawn. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his hands were at his sides, fingers curled stiffly. I couldn't tell if he was waiting for something or if he was just lost in thought, but his silence was deafening. It was as though he wasn't even a real person, just a shadow caught in the rain. I wanted to call out again, but something held me back. I had a bad feeling, a gut-wrenching certainty that something wasn't right. My eyes scanned the area behind him. The woods were dark, nearly impossible to see beyond the beam of my flashlight, but I felt as though I were being watched from every direction. A sudden wave of nausea washed over me, and I instinctively backed away a step. That's when I saw it. There was a rustling behind the man, just beyond his right side. A movement so slight it could have been the wind. But then it happened again, a larger shift in the foliage, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and sprinted back toward the cabin, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the man's gaze on me as I ran, though I didn't dare look back. The storm was deafening now, the rain pouring down in sheets, but my mind was focused only on getting to the cabin. I reached the door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it quickly, my breathing ragged. I turned around to find the cabin empty and dark, save for the flickering candles. I stood there for a few moments, heart still racing, trying to calm myself. What had just happened? Who was that man? And why had he been standing there like that? I told myself it was just some kind of strange encounter. Maybe someone who had gotten lost or was just waiting out the storm. But even as I tried to reason with myself, a nagging thought kept creeping into my mind. Something was wrong. The rest of the night was a blur. I barely slept. The sound of the storm and the image of the man haunting me. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the cabin creak. Every creak, every groan of the old wood, sent my heart leaping into my throat. I didn't dare step outside again, not after what I'd seen. The man's presence lingered in my thoughts, as though his eerie stillness had seeped into the very air I was breathing. Morning eventually came, though the storm hadn't let up. I decided to pack up and leave early. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in these woods. Maybe it was the storm, maybe it was the strange encounter, but I felt as though I needed to get away. I had enough of the isolation for one weekend. I didn't see the man again as I packed my gear into the car, and I didn't hear any more footsteps or rustling in the woods. The rain continued to pour, the road was slick, and the trees were swaying heavily in the wind. I started the car, ready to put the night behind me. The whole time I drove, I couldn't help but glance into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The drive back to town was long and uneventful, though I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me. Every time I passed a shadow in the trees or a dark patch of road, my heart would skip a beat. But by the time I reached the main highway and the familiar, bustling town came into view, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I pulled into a small diner just outside of town to grab a coffee, still jittery from the night's events. As I sat down, trying to calm myself, I overheard a conversation between the waitress and a truck driver sitting at the counter. They were talking about a man who had been seen wandering the woods for the last few days. A man who looked out of place, someone who didn't belong. The truck driver mentioned that they'd heard rumors of strange encounters with him, but no one really knew who he was or where he came from. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Could it have been him? The man I'd seen? My heart sank as I realized that I might have been right to be scared. That man, whatever he was, wasn't just a random traveler. He was something else, something I had barely escaped. I left the diner quickly, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something watching, waiting. I drove the rest of the way home with one thought on my mind. What if I had never left the cabin? What if I had stayed just a little longer?